Oh, there you are. Okay. Thank you, Maria. All right. Welcome to the October 25th, 2022 Standard of Care Ad Hoc Committee meeting of the California State Board of Pharmacy. My name is Song Oh, chairperson of the committee. Before we convene, I'd like to remind everyone present that the board is a consumer protection agency charged with administering and enforcing pharmacy law, where protection of the public is inconsistent with other interests sought to be promoted. Protection of the public shall be paramount. This meeting is being conducted consistent with the provisions of Government Code Section 11133. Participants watching the webcast will only be able to observe the meeting. Anyone interested in participating in the meeting must join the WebEx meeting. Information and instructions are posted on our website. As I facilitate this meeting, I will announce when we are accepting public comment. I have advised the meeting moderator to allot 3 minutes to each individual providing comments. During certain portions of the meeting, when indicated, we will allow individuals to comment more than once on a specific question under consideration. During this time, the committee respectfully requests that individuals seeking to provide additional comment refrain from restating their previous comments. This approach is necessary to facilitate this meeting and ensure the committee has the opportunity to complete its necessary business. Also, we're finally tackling some in-depth questions, and depending on how much we get through, we may need another meeting before our scheduled February meeting. We will know depending on how much we get through today. I'd like to ask staff moderating the meeting to provide general instructions for members of the public participating via WebEx. Moderator?
This is the moderator, and before we get started, I would like to remind board members and staff who are not speaking to mute your microphones. If I detect any background noise during the meeting as a result of unmuted mics, I will mute that microphone. For members of the public in the audience, meeting minutes are being taken, so I ask that members and staff please identify themselves before speaking. When public comment is requested, I, the moderator, will turn on the WebEx question and answer feature to facilitate this. Comments will be limited to the topic addressed in that specific agenda item. We will display instructions on the screen each time, and members may click on the question mark, typically located at the lower right-hand corner of your WebEx screen, and type the word comment into the text box, and then send the request to be recognized. You may also use the raise hand feature by clicking the hand icon at the bottom row of your computer's WebEx screen. Or if you are a call-in only or audio only participant, you can press *3 on your device to raise your hand. Each commenter will be given the opportunity to unmute themselves, and they'll be given 3 minutes to speak and a 10-second warning. At the end of that time, their microphone will then be muted, and we will move on to the next commenter. As a note, agenda items requesting topics that do not appear on the agenda. This is only for a brief suggestion of topic. Due to the public meeting laws, panelists are not allowed to have any discussion of the issue other than to note that the request for future discussion, and the request is not guarantee that the topic will appear on a future agenda. This is not a forum to ask questions of the panelists, nor is it to engage in discussion of any topic on the agenda. And I believe that is all my instructions.
Thank you, Sarah. I'd like to take a roll call to establish a quorum. Members, as I call your name, please remember to open your line before speaking. Maria Serpa.
Licensee member present.
Hi, Maria. Good morning. Renee Barker.
Licensee member present.
Indira Cameron Banks. Indira is not joining today. Jesse Crowley.
Licensee member present.
Thank you, Jesse. And Nicole Tebow.
Licensee member present.
Thank you, Nicole. And I am here. A quorum has been established. Members, as we begin, I'd like to thank you for all of your time and commitment to evaluation of this issue. This issue may appear on its face to be simple. However, it is quite complex. I ask everyone participating today to be respectful of the work before the committee today. We encourage participation by members of the public throughout our meeting at appropriate times. The committee respectfully requests that when comments are provided, they're done so in a professional manner, consistent with how the committee conducts its business. I'll now open the committee for public comments for items not on the agenda. I'd like to remind members of the public that you're not required to identify yourself, but may do so. I'd also like to remind everyone that the committee cannot take action on these items except to decide whether to place an item on a future agenda. Members, following public comments for this agenda item, I will ask members to comment on what, if any, items should be placed on a future agenda. As a reminder, this agenda item is not intended to be a discussion, rather an opportunity for members of the committee and members of the public to request consideration of an item for future placement on an agenda, at which time discussion may occur. Moderator?
This is the moderator. In the direction of the committee, I have opened up the Q&A feature for public comment. Members of the public, if you would like to make a comment for items not on the agenda, please click the Q&A icon located at the bottom right-hand corner of your WebEx screen or use the raise hand function. And audio-only participants can raise their hand by pressing *3 on their device. It looks like we have requests for comment from an individual logged in as Stephen Simons. Stephen, you'll be given 3 minutes to speak and a 10-second warning. Please click the unmute me button when the prompt appears on your device.
For far less than 3 minutes, I'm speaking on behalf of the Cedars-Sinai Health System, where I'm a former chief of staff and chair of medication safety. I've been a physician at that organization for many years. And I just wanted to use this opportunity to recognize and express our appreciation for the fact that pharmacists are allowed to act proactively and maximize their licensed abilities. The pharmacists at our organization regularly intervene and prevent adverse events for our patients, both in terms of inpatients for whom physicians have enthusiastically chosen the wrong option from pull-down menus on our EMR, for their interventions when patients are transferred from one area of care to another. They often pick up omissions and duplications of medications. And most importantly, owing to the guidance and inspiration of Dr. Rita Shane, our director of pharmacy, we have a major effort looking at reconciliation of discharge medications. And regularly, our pharmacists pick up omissions and duplications at discharge that would have resulted in patient readmissions. Without the contributions of our pharmacists, our entire organization's performance, which was recently recognized as #1 in California by US News and World Report, our performance would not be what it is. And on behalf of the organization, I wanted to express our appreciation and also encourage the board to continue to allow and encourage pharmacists to be able to practice at the top of their license. Thank you.
All right, this is the moderator. It appears that was our only individual who has requested public comment. Would you like me to close the Q&A feature?
Yes, please. Thank you. Thank you for the comment. We really appreciate that. Moving on to the next agenda item 3, approval of August 25th, 2022 meeting minutes. Members, included in attachment 1 of the meeting materials is draft minutes from the committee's August 25th, 2022 meeting. As we begin, do you have any questions or comments on the draft minutes? And if part of your comments, if you could also make a motion if you believe such an action is appropriate, members.
Hi, Sung. It's Jessie. I did notice a typo on page 5, starting with the paragraph that says Member Crowley. It looks like there are some typos in the second sentence, so it's a little unclear what that sentence was getting at. And I just wanted to make sure that the intention of my comment was just to point out that the success of the barbershop study was due to trusted community members collaborating with pharmacists rather than pharmacists alone. So I just wanted to make sure that the gist of that was corrected.
Jesse, do you have? I see that a lot of times I just don't even try to correct the typos, but for your sentence specifically, is there anything specific that you would like to change it and how it's reflected? I noticed that the sentence doesn't kind of make sense. So
yeah. So I would just something along the lines of, even the authors of the study recognize that Part of the success was due to the collaboration between pharmacists and community members rather than just pharmacists themselves. I just wanted to make sure that the gist of that was in there.
Okay. Um,
Should I make a motion to correct that?
oh yeah, I think just to be safe, if you make a motion, just to say as
Okay.
what you just stated and to make sure that that's corrected. I believe Anne and the executive officer and the staff has the authority to just update and change any typos at any time, as far as I know. Please correct me if that's not the case, Eileen or Anne. But so I think if it's a minor typo, those are all can be cleaned up at a later time. Just make sure we get the bulk of the thought. As long as that's reflected, I believe that that's what's really important. So,
Hi, President. Oh, this is Eileen Smiley, and I agree, typos can be fixed, but with the motion for what Member Crowley had mentioned is if somebody wants to make a motion to approve the minutes, it would be to approve the minutes with the corrections to page 5, to reflect the gist of her comment as was explained during the meeting.
Yep. Does that sound good to you, Jesse?
Yeah, I can make that motion.
Thank you, Jesse. Anyone second Jesse's motion?
This is Renee Barker. I can second that.
Thank you, Renee, with the motion and second. Any other comments from members? Hearing none, we'll go to public comment. Please, Sarah.
This is the moderator, and at the direction of the committee, I've opened up the Q&A feature for public comment. Members of the public, if you would like to make a comment on this item, please click the Q&A icon located at the bottom right-hand corner of your WebEx screen or use the raise hand function. And audio-only participants can raise their hand by pressing *3 on their device. I'll pause a moment to allow the public time to access those features and submit their requests. All right, and seeing none, would you like me to close that Q&A panel?
Yes, please. Thank you so much. Okay, with a motion, a second, and public comment, we'll take a roll call vote. Maria, how do you vote?
Yes.
Thank you, Maria. Renee?
Yes.
Thank you, Renee. Jesse?
Yes.
Thank you. Nicole?
Yes.
Thank you. And I vote yes, the motion passes. Moving on to the next agenda item for discussion and consideration of results of pharmacist survey related to current practice and possible movement to standard of care enforcement model. You may recall that during our last meeting, we determined it appropriate to conduct a survey as a means to solicit feedback from stakeholders that were unable to attend our meetings and provide input. As part of our discussion, we agreed on general questions and I worked with staff to finalize. We were fortunate to again work with DCA experts in survey design as part of the final review before releasing the survey. The survey was available from September 13th through October 3rd. As indicated in the meeting materials, over 1,700 pharmacists provide responses, which is very significant, and we appreciate your time. And if you are ready, just if you could quickly share some of the results and highlights. We're not going to go through all the, two details, but go ahead, Anne. Floor is yours.
Thank you for the opportunity. So I'm just going to quickly go over some of the results because there's a lot to go on to be discussed today. So we asked some basic demographic information, including whether or not the respondent is currently licensed in California. The vast majority were. In addition, about 88%, 87% indicated that they are currently actively practicing in pharmacy as a pharmacist. We also talked about the next question. I apologize. If you could, next one more, please. So we asked about what best describes their practice setting, and almost half of respondents indicated that they work in community pharmacy, about 23% in hospital, and then you'll notice ambulatory care as well, but other is also one of the larger respondent categories. So I wanted to just give a little bit of context to that. some of the themes within other, including consultant pharmacists, pharmacists working in correctional facilities, HMOs, hospice, long-term care. A couple of people indicated retail there, retired, as well as specialty pharmacies. So if we could go to that next slide, please. This just provides the breakdown of those that are actively practicing versus those that are not in the various practice settings. Next slide. So this slide really indicates that respondents in most of the settings report providing patient care services. Next slide. We talked about whether or not there were opportunities for additional functions that could be added to a pharmacist's scope of practice, and you'll notice that 41% of respondents indicated that that answer is yes. So the next slide kind of shares some of what those common themes were, and this was included, so I'm not going to go over it. Next slide, please. So this question I thought was a little bit interesting because when we asked, initially about whether or not, there's additional opportunities for pharmacists, and the follow-up question was, do you think that you believe that protocols should be required to perform these additional duties? And you'll notice that 35% indicated yes, 28% indicated no. So I wanted to quickly give you a little bit of a breakdown on those. So for individuals that indicated protocols were appropriate, with the exception of academia and administration, all other care settings indicated that a protocol, the majority of respondents indicated that a protocol would be appropriate. For protocols being determined not necessary, that is where the majority of academia and administration responded. So as an example, for protocols are necessary, 276 pharmacists working in community indicated that protocols were appropriate, where 177 respondents in community indicated that protocols were not. So just wanted to provide a little bit of context on that one so you could see what it looked like. Next slide, please. Which is specific to whether or not individuals are providing patient care services under collaborative practice agreements, and the data is kind of self-explanatory. Same with the next slide, please. So what I will highlight here is that it appears that there may be opportunities for some additional education on changes in the law because the majority of the respondents indicated in the practice settings that they were not aware of the expansion of the CPA. Next slide. So the next slide speaks to whether or not the respondent believes that there's barriers to providing patient care. And if we go to that next slide, those are some of the common responses that were seen across the various practice settings. Next slide. So the next two slides were interesting and I think will be helpful information for the committee as they're considering many of these questions. The first is, do you believe that your current work conditions allow sufficient time to make patient-based decisions? And you'll see that it does vary based on the practice setting, but the majority of individuals working in community pharmacy indicated that they do not. Next slide. Next spoke to autonomy. And again, in many of the practice settings, they indicate that they do believe that they have sufficient autonomy. However, in community pharmacy, it was not. Next slide. This speaks to whether or not employers develop policies and procedures that define how something goes. And again, this is when we're considering, opportunities for change. This may help the committee understand maybe where additional changes need to be made to ensure that there's autonomy. Next slide. This speaks to whether or not there's policies and procedures related to dispensing of controlled substances. And that next slide, please. This talks about whether or not an employer has a system of, blocking certain kinds of things. And again, that potentially goes to whether or not there is autonomy in the ability to take care of patients. And that last slide is really just talking about policies and procedures to incentivize. And I think that based on some of the comments that were received here, I think people interpreted this question in two different ways. One, many looked at it as, is the employer incentivizing pharmacists to provide certain kinds of services, whereas others were maybe looking at it through the consumer lens. Is the consumer incentivized to have different kinds of services, immunizations, those kinds of things? And so that was it, just Reader's Digest version. Thank you for the time.
Thank you, and members, any questions, comments, please, for Anne? I just want to thank Anne before we move on also for all the work, and thanks DCA again for coming up with this survey, releasing it, and all the pharmacists who participated in it. Okay, hearing no comments, we'll move on. I'm sure we will kind of talk about survey somehow as part of next discussion. And so here we are, next agenda, and then we'll do public comment really quick as well, Sarah.
This is the moderator, and at the direction of the committee, I've opened up the Q&A feature for public comment. Members of the public, if you would like to make a comment on this item, please click the Q&A icon located at the bottom right-hand corner of your WebEx screen, or use the raise hand function. Looks like I do have a couple individuals who requested comment. We'll start with individual identified as John Gray. And John, you'll be given 3 minutes to speak and a 10-second warning. Please click the unmute me button when the prompt appears on your device.
Hi, good morning. This is John Gray. I'm a registered pharmacist with Kaiser Permanente. Thank you very much for the opportunity to provide comment. Just want to thank the executive officer for the really nice overview of the survey results. And I really just want to take the opportunity to echo one thing that the executive officer pointed out around 4052, the new provisions in Business and Professions Code 4052A13, opening up the ability for, any pharmacist or group of pharmacists to enter into collaborative practice agreements with any provider with prescriptive authority or group of providers with prescriptive authority. Just want to echo what she said about perhaps it would be a benefit for the board to provide a little education to the regulated public about that. I personally have encountered colleagues who are skeptical that 4052A13, the intent is for it to do what it is actually intended to do, which is to provide, broad authority for, essentially any pharmacist to engage in collaborative practice agreements. So I do think it would be helpful if the board is able to, perhaps the Communication and Public Education Committee is able to, take the opportunity to provide a little education to the regulated public. Thank you for the opportunity to provide comments.
All right, this is the moderator. We'll move on to our next individual who has requested public comment. Individual I signed in as Richard Dang. And Richard, you'll be given 3 minutes to speak and a 10-second warning. Please click the unmute me button when the prompt appears on your device.
Richard Dang, President of the California Pharmacists Association. Thanks for allowing me time to provide public comment. I just wanted to point out that there was additionally some confusion about the survey questions that we had received from several members and colleagues. There appeared to be several questions that conflated the definition and use of policies and procedures, protocols, collaborative practice agreements across the different questions. So that might have introduced some confusion as well. So as the board is reviewing the results and discussing the feasibility and appropriateness of policies and procedures, protocols, and collaborative practice agreements, that the definitions are used consistently and clearly as they are referring to different items. Additionally, looking at the survey results a little bit more clearly, I do want to point out a few trends that I was noticing that may be related to each other. So in the survey question asking about the autonomy of the pharmacist, the community pharmacy setting was the one setting that reported the most pharmacists feeling like they lacked autonomy in their decision-making for patient care services. And you'll also notice that community pharmacies were the one setting that the majority of respondents indicating lacking a collaborative practice agreement or lacking a protocol. I do believe that my interpretation is that many of those two items are significantly related. As you will see, the prevalence of collaborative practice agreements and protocols more highly used in ambulatory care and hospital settings. Those pharmacists are reporting greater autonomy in their decision-making process. And I would encourage the board to look at that. And my assessment would be that the increased use of collaborative practice agreements and protocols in the community setting can help pharmacists have greater autonomy in the decision-making processes, and by extension, the implementation of a standard of care model in that setting would strengthen the pharmacist's autonomy to make decisions in those patient care settings. Thank you.
All right, this is the moderator. We will move on to our next individual who has requested public comment. Individual signed in as Dr. Christopher Adkins. And Dr. Adkins, you'll be given 3 minutes to speak and a 10-second warning. Please click the unmute me button when the prompt appears on your device.
In Southern California. And my comment will mostly reflect what Dr. Dang just said in regards to the community pharmacy, recognizing the disparities in the autonomy that we have in our practice setting. It is obviously very largely in the community pharmacy setting, and I think more largely specifically in chain community pharmacy, where there are a lot of policies and procedures that we have to follow, and in one of the questions that cannot deviate from. In a lot of cases, we cannot deviate from it. Or if we can, we really have to justify that to our employers who are not pharmacists. So we're very largely beholden to practicing pharmacy and justifying that to people who are not pharmacists. So a lot of the decision making that goes on in retail pharmacy, especially chain pharmacy, is being made by people who are not pharmacists or who are not practicing pharmacy. And the pharmacists really lack a lot of autonomy and a lot of decision making that can obviously help improve patients' lives, as was made in the first comment before we started talking about the questionnaire. And that's all that I want to say in my comment really, is that I think the questionnaire reflects that greatly. That was obviously the largest disparity, and I think it speaks for itself. Thank you for allowing me to comment.
All right, this is the moderator. Appears that was our last individual who has requested public comment. Would you like me to close the Q&A feature?
Yes, please. Thank you, everyone, for your comment. Someone saying something on the, oh, it's okay. There, thought I saw something. Thank you. Thank you for the comments. All right, so we'll move on to the next agenda item. Here we are, agenda item 5, discussion and consideration of policy questions related to standard of care enforcement model in the practice of pharmacy. As we move on to our next item, I would like to remind everyone present of the language provided in Business and Professions Code Section 4301.3 that states, on or before July 1st of 2023, the board shall convene a work group of interested stakeholders to discuss whether moving to a standard of care enforcement model would be feasible and appropriate for the regulation of pharmacy, and make recommendations to the legislature about the outcome of these discussions through a report submitted pursuant to Section 9795 of the Government Code. Thank you for your patience while I read the law there. I think it is important for us to remember what the legislature is asking of the board. As council has reminded us on occasion, the discussion has drifted to using standard of care to expand scope of practice. I'll ask council to help bring us back to the task at hand during our consideration of some of the policy questions we will be considering today. We can consider expansion of scope of practice in the report, if that is where stakeholders are going to and we want to do, but we also want to address the legislature's main question to us about whether moving to a standard of care enforcement model is both feasible and appropriate for pharmacy law. I feel like I'm playing with the words, pretending to be a lawyer. I am not. I'm just trying to heed the advice of the council. So that's where we are going. So As we have discussed on several occasions, the board already uses a standard of care enforcement model. However, I think consistent with the legislative mandate to see if there are opportunities to more robustly use such model in enforcement, I'd like to draw everyone's attention to the meeting materials where two examples of how the standard of care enforcement model is currently applied in investigation and enforcement. To ensure we provide a report to the legislature as required, I suggest we try to stay focused on considering the standard of care enforcement model as we discuss the questions first and share our views, and then whether it would be appropriate to change the current disciplinary process to solely a standard of care enforcement model, or whether the existing hybrid model should be retained. As we proceed, we must be mindful of the board's consumer protection mandate while also identifying other interests. Sorry for all the long comments here. And before we get started, I wanted to check in with members to see if you have any questions or comments before. Also, as it is required for us to have somewhat clear consensus and notate if dissent is voiced for the purposes of report, I'll be calling each members for each question today. Some questions could just be simple as I agree. I wanted to make sure we capture your thoughts as a whole committee. In many cases, I take your silence as you generally agreeing along, but for this discussion, I like each of your clear thoughts on each question. And lastly, we will be opening this for public comments for at least 3 minutes, but typically we're gonna allow repeat for anyone interested on each questions. And I typically prefer to start the discussion by opening up for members, but this time I'm going to offer my thoughts first to start the discussion flowing and go down the list for each member discussion. I'm not trying to influence anyone's thoughts, just wanted to kind of get things going so we have discussions flowing. Today is a very important day for this committee to truly gather everyone's thoughts on questions, dissect it to get to the bottom of what we have been discussing and gathering information on for the last few months. And thank you everyone again for enduring through this committee. And thank you all stakeholders, all the participants, and all the great presentations and information gathered. It's really been really helpful. And thank you so much for all your time in being involved in this committee and participating, and I really, really appreciate all of them. So thank you all for all the stakeholders as well. So let's get started. And before I do start, just want to open up for members to see if you have any comments before we get started. Okay, so we're ready to start. So starting with question 1, with the understanding of the board's current enforcement model approach that is a hybrid model, does the committee believe that changing the current structure is appropriate for facilities, including pharmacies, wholesale distributors, 3PLs, or other facilities licensed by the board? For example, do you believe that an enforcement action should only be allowed against the facility for a violation of standard care by a pharmacist, even if a specific federal or state statute or rules is violated? So I'm going to start here. To me, I do not believe very strongly that any changes should be made to how the board regulates facilities. I would be extremely worried about any transition to favoring solely the standard of care over compliance with state and federal laws governing facilities licensed by the board. Federal state rules establish a standard of care in certain places, and I believe that violations of these statutes and rules should continue to be the basis for disciplinary or administrative action against the facility license. Also, I believe it is important to note that whatever the legislature determines about the role of prescriptive rules and statutes should play under California law, the federal requirements applicable to these facilities will not be amended, changed, or eliminated. And I believe that as a condition of licensure in California, violation of these rules and requirements should continue to be the basis for discipline or administrative action against the licensee. The FDA has effective enforcement tools for violations, but does not have the power to grant or revoke pharmacy licenses and other facility licenses at this time. I believe that the violation of federal and or state statutes or rules should continue to be the basis for enforcement and or administrative action against the state issued license as the oversight of pharmacies are primarily with the Board of Pharmacy. With that, I'm going to open up for each comments. So starting with Maria, your thoughts?
Thank you, Mr. President. I totally agree with your comments. I'm just going to add that facilities are very different than an individual, a person. A person has the education and experience to allow them judgment and to discern issues. There are requirements of licensure that are clear and concise for facilities that are not the same as we are discussing regarding individuals. Thank you.
Thank you for the comment, Maria. All right, we'll go down to Renee.
Hi, yeah, thank you for your comments. Very, very, very well said. Better than I was formulating in my head. But yes, I would agree that also just that facilities, I don't think approach quite the, like what Maria said, it's not individuals, and these are licensed. So I would, I would agree that it does not necessarily apply to facilities.
Thank you, Renee. Go to Jessie. Jessie?
Thank you, Sung. I also agree with that. I think in some of our previous discussions, we had mentioned that some of the other boards that do operate under a standard of care model with the DCA do not actually have facilities. So this makes it a little unique to us. And for that reason, all the reasons said before, I completely agree.
Thank you, Jessie. And Nicole?
Yes, everyone already said all of the really good comments, but I agree. A facility, there's no discretionary logic to be used for a facility in the same way there is for an individual.
Thank you, Nicole. Okay, thank you for your comments. And with that, moderator, please open the lines for public comment. As a reminder, we are focused on the first question, and there's a lot of subsection within a question as well. So there is going to be a lot of public comment, open up discussion. So bear with us. That's
This is the moderator, and at the direction of the committee, I've opened up the Q&A feature for public comment. Members of the public, if you would like to make a comment on this item, please click the Q&A feature located at the bottom right-hand corner of your WebEx screen, or use the raise hand function. And it does look like we have a request for comment from an individual logged in as Kevin. Kevin, you'll be given 3 minutes to speak and a 10-second warning. Please click the unmute me button when the prompt appears on your device.
Komodo. I'm a community pharmacist representing the Southern Central Valley in Kern County. First, I wanted to thank you guys for looking into standard of care versus scope of practice. I really believe from the results of the survey and this discussion, I appreciate the board's identification of the possible contributions of an individual, as well as the possible savings that it can have as far as adverse outcomes in the community setting. One of my concerns that I've seen with regards to the current model as it stands is right now, I think that the process is a little over prescriptive. I know right now there's some discussion as far as definition, as far as like whether this fits under scope of practice or standard of care. I would like to see a movement more towards more of stepping back from the prescriptive nature. And I'll give an example of an issue we had in the community pharmacy setting. Right now, we're looking at issues with regards to the candy fentanyl, in which there's a lot of concern, and there's been delays from the school district in getting access to naloxone. And so right now we're trying to address issues within our community of one, educating people about the potential dangers, how to avoid it, but then two, trying to get access to naloxone. There's a lot of teachers that we're working with, and one of the things right now is the existing protocol on file is Business and Professions Code 1746.3. And in that protocol, some of the things it starts to talk about when you talk about Section C1, It goes into things about when we're screening and when we're doing all of these things to determine whether or not to furnish naloxone. There has to be, we have to look at the potential for and the history of illicit drug abuse before furnishing opioids. And in this case, most of the people that we're looking at don't actually have any type of history with the medication. But we're looking at a public health situation in which it would be necessary and quite probable that the people that we'd be working with would need that medication for the possible exposure. I think just philosophically, one of the things I would like to see from the board is, as we're assessing this hybrid model, the movement away from some more of these prescriptive types of models and moving more towards allowing the clinician to be able to make the appropriate assessment. Because I think most of us, as you saw from the survey, a lot of us do want to have some guidance. But at the same time, too, I think providing us the ability to be able to make that clinical
10 seconds.
Thank you very much for your time, and I appreciate you hearing me out.
Thank you, Kevin. Go ahead, Sarah.
This is a moderator. It looks like we have another individual who has requested public comment. Let me find them in my attendee list. Nathan Painter. Nathan, you'll be given 3 minutes to speak and a 10-second warning. Please click the unmute me button when the prompt appears on your device.
The other comments, but just thinking about the overall impression and intent for standard of care model. I don't believe, especially in the other presentations that were done in the first and second meeting, that it ever intended to affect facilities. So I don't want to say that this point is moot, but I'm pretty sure that other discussions and documentation has really focused on the healthcare professional and the practice of pharmacy, not any kind of business or management of pharmacies. And certainly the standard of care model incorporates federal law, which is the standard of care. Just focusing more on the actual practice of pharmacy and the individual pharmacist is the intent of standard of care. Thank you.
Okay, this is the moderator. We'll move on to our next individual who has requested public comment. Lisa Kroon. Lisa, you'll be given 3 minutes to speak and a 10-second warning. Please click the unmute me button when the prompt appears on your device.
Kroon, UCSF faculty member and practicing AmCare pharmacist. Just to expand on what my colleague Nathan Painter has commented on, the survey, while very interesting, I'm not sure it really captured opinions and perceptions around standard of care. I think that's still out there and confusing to people just what that means. It's really not about expanding scope of practice, but allowing all pharmacists in any practice setting to practice based on their level of education and training. And unfortunately, what the survey showed you is that our community pharmacists in California are not practicing to the top of their license due to our existing framework. Unfortunately, SB 493 and the APP has borne out not to be a very viable mechanism for our community pharmacists to engage in more CPAs and practice-based care. They are not able to intervene in a timely manner to promote patient safety and patient outcomes. For example, other states such as Colorado have recently enacted legislation that allows a community pharmacist to perform therapeutic substitution without a CPA. And the final comment is around our protocols. Our statewide protocols quickly become out of date and are not really useful for our pharmacists. And I'll just speak to the NRT protocol, which had excluded Chantix based on a boxed warning. That boxed warning was...
Sorry, our council is trying to say something, so I just want to make sure. What's going on, Eileen?
Hi, President O. It's Eileen Smiley. I just want to remind
We'll
commenters
pick back to-
that
Yeah, okay.
that we are commenting on really whether this should be open to facilities. You're going to have an opportunity to comment with respect to pharmacists, but the way the legislature directed this board, they asked whether movement to a standard of care enforcement model should apply to pharmacy law without specifying just a pharmacist. Pharmacy law also includes the regulation and the licensure of facilities. So to facilitate this discussion, I know people have got a lot of things to say when it comes to the pharmacist, but if we could keep comments directed to what's been open for public comment, it will help the meeting flow and ensure that we can get through the widest variety of questions.
Thank you, Eileen. Dr. Kroon, if you could just open her up so that she can close her comments, and then I just want to say globally that as from just certain comments I heard, that there will be an ample opportunity for us to discuss those issues. So please bear with us. As I said, it's specific questions are laid out, so we'll have plenty of time. I'm sorry to eat up all your day to be with us here at the Board of Pharmacy. I'm sorry that you could be spending much time on better served somewhere else, but you're stuck with us. So since you're here, stay with us and spend your day, and there will be ample opportunity. So with that, if moderator could open up Dr. Kroon just before we go to next.
This is the moderator. I requested the unmute, but it looks like she muted again.
Yes, my apologies for making my comment at this time. I can continue on later on when it's more appropriate.
Okay,
and this
thank
is
you.
Very good use of our time. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah, we'll definitely, there's going to be opportunities. So thank you. Okay.
All right, this is the moderator. We'll move on to our next individual, Rita Shane. And Rita, you'll be given 3 minutes to speak and a 10-second warning. Please click the unmute me button when the prompt appears on your device.
I believe I'm speaking to the facility question. I think the uniqueness of our profession is that we're tied to dispensing, and we are the most qualified and the most trained in the area of drug therapy management, but yet because of the traditional focus on dispensing, which occurred for decades before most of us were in practice, some of the state board regulations tend to limit what we do, and therefore the practice of pharmacy and pharmacies also reflects what the survey responses demonstrated, which is that pharmacists don't have the time to do the essential functions that we know pharmacists are capable of doing. And ironically, nurse practitioners and physician assistants who have nowhere near the training that pharmacists have are prescribing and able to perform under a standard practice, whereas we're held to lots and lots of traditional rules, which were done for the right reasons, for the public health purpose, but are now sometimes interfering with our ability to provide care in pharmacies for our elderly patients who have the polydoc, polypharmacy, polydisease phenomenon that we are seeing and happening, especially in California and throughout the country as well. So I support that we can continue this dialogue, determine how we move to standard of care, and support the community pharmacists so that they can actually leverage their knowledge and skills to prevent harm to our patients who these days are on at least 15 drugs, any geriatric patient. That is average, that is documented, that is in the literature. And I'm more than happy to spend my time on these sorts of discussions as we move towards preventing harm to our patients throughout the state of California. This is an essential conversation. The errors we're seeing introduced with the growth of allied health professionals are quite frightening, and we are the ones who have the knowledge, skills, and training to prevent that harm. Thank you so much for the opportunity to provide input.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
All right, this is the moderator, and that appears that was our last individual who has requested public comment. Would you like me to close the Q&A panel?
Yes, please. Thank you, Sarah. Moving on to the next question, sub-question. I'm sorry, there's some sub-questions. So this is a quick question, though. Do you, as a theoretical matter, believe that disciplinary actions against facility license could continue to be predicated on either violation of a specific state or federal statute or rule. As I stated earlier, I believe facility license should continue to be regulated for compliance with specific state and federal laws and rules. Believe from a consumer protection perspective that is vital. So since this is a kind of a redux of last question, I won't go through all the members unless you have any thoughts. Okay, we'll then go to public comment again, really quick. Sorry, Sarah, there's going to be a lot of these back and forth, so bear with us.
I was speaking while I was muted. I'm sorry. This is the moderator, and at the direction of the board, I've opened up the Q&A feature for public comment. Members of the public, if you would like to make a comment on this item, please click the Q&A icon located at the bottom right-hand corner of your WebEx screen or use the raise hand function. I'll pause a moment to allow the public time to access those features and submit their requests. All right, and seeing none, would you like me to close that Q&A panel?
Thank you, Sarah. With that, last question really related to facilities is questioning if we believe that change to some of the prescriptive statutes and regulations should be changed or modernized. As we discuss this question specifically, I think we need to focus on how that would impact consumer protection. I believe our regulation of pharmacy is appropriate. I believe it is important to continually evaluate the changes, but in general, I do not see any need to remove what some may view as prescriptive statute for facilities, as if I may share an example, when we evaluate some of the changes the board has made in response to things happening in the marketplace, it is always with our consumer protection focus in mind. Prior to the board's inventory reconciliation regulation, as an example, significant drug losses were relatively common in marketplace. In fiscal year 2016 through 27, over 351,376 dosage units were lost due to employee pilferage. In fiscal year 2019 through 2020, that number dropped to 82,225. As a reminder, the board's regulations became effective in April of 2018. If stakeholders want to identify specific California rules and or statutes that they believe should be amended or changed, that is a separate inquiry, and I believe they should be identified specifically to enable the board and the legislature to evaluate the policy goals and the requirements advanced and whether changes are warranted. I do not believe it warrants a radical change today to the board's hybrid enforcement model, members. And I'm gonna start with, I think, Renee, or was it Jesse, I believe this one? Yeah, I'm gonna just go down the list so that you start first.
Sung, I agree with you. I don't think any changes would be necessary.
Thank you, Jesse. Nicole?
Yeah, I agree. I don't think there's changes necessary at this time. We just need to keep watching and adjusting over time as needed, but I can't think of anything right now.
Thank you. Maria?
I agree. I just wanted to state that, while we hope that our regulations, and we don't have really control over the laws, but the regulations are distinct. They're not often as clear or concise as we would like. So we end up having to have more discussion regarding self-assessments or creating FAQs. Those aren't necessarily the fixes, but we always strive to try to be more clear and concise to help everyone understand.
Thank you, Maria. Renee?
Hi, yeah, I think I echo everybody's comments and also including Nicole's, which is that I don't believe there's any changes at this time. But I do think that as we progress with the information and thoughts that we would just revisit to make sure that there's not any barriers to moving forward with any kind of changes, or look and see if we need to, just any updates that might need to happen there or other thoughts. But at this time, no.
Thank you, Renee. Thank you. With that, moderator, please open the line for public comment.
This is the moderator, and at the direction of the committee, I've opened up the Q&A feature for public comment. Members of the public, if you would like to make a comment on this item, please click the Q&A icon located at the bottom right-hand corner of your WebEx screen or use the raise hand function. I'll pause a moment to allow the public time to access those features and submit their requests. All right, and seeing none, would you like me to close that Q&A panel?
Yes, please. Thank you, Sarah. Moving on to question 2. We'll now transition to consideration of non-pharmacist personnel. Specifically, do we believe a standard of care enforcement model is feasible and appropriate in the regulation of non-pharmacist licensed personnel, such as pharmacy technicians, designated representatives, and interns, etc.? This question again seems straightforward for most non-pharmacist licensed personnel, with perhaps not pharmacist interns. None of these licensees that are not pharmacists have significant and rigorous education requirements, nor do their licenses allow them to exercise significant form of professional judgment. Also similar to the roles, statutes, and regulations play for facilities, specific statutes and rules on the federal and state level establish a minimum standard of care, and I do believe violations of these statutes and rules should continue to form the basis for disciplinary and administrative action. Members, please share your thoughts, starting with Nicole. What are your thoughts, Nicole, on this issue of non-pharmacist personnel?
I agree with you. I think the pharmacy interns is the piece that's a little harder, that there is an amount of judgment there that needs to be taken into consideration. But I think otherwise it makes sense to follow the more prescriptive regulations. However, I do think we need to look at scope of practice for pharmacy technicians. I understand that is a different piece of this, but I want to throw that out there.
Thank you, Nicole. Maria?
Thank you. I think just a couple of comments that individuals that are licensed and not pharmacists do not have the education, experience, nor the responsibility to allow for judgment in situations. And I would include pharmacy technicians in that group. While they're on the path of gaining independence and judgment, at the time of practicing as a pharmacy intern, should they come into a situation that requires judgment, I would think that would require a discussion with the pharmacist, that's their supervisor, to help them in formulating a plan rather than having independent judgment when they're only a pharmacy intern. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. Renee?
Hi, yes, thank you for your other comments. I would have to agree also. I think looking at the different licensed like interns or technicians, if it's going to be based on their level of education and training, you know, that is always going to be less than a pharmacist. So they still would have, you know, limited ability in their judgment. And I think that, you know, again, with our mandate for safety, there's just a concern there. So they would still always need to be under the guidance of a pharmacist. And I do believe, if it was Nicole who also said, you know, just following, they would still need to follow more prescriptive type regulations. So I do think that they would possibly be excluded from this standard of care.
Thank you, Renee. Jati?
I agree with all the previous comments. Definitely technicians, I don't think should have any judgment necessarily due to the inconsistent training, I guess, for technician requirements here. In terms of pharmacy interns, I mean, I think the the regulations we have already give the pharmacist on duty that flexibility to determine what it is an intern can and can't do based on their training. And therefore, I don't think there's really a need to change it. I think what we have is sufficient.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for your comments. We're ready for public comment. Moderator, again, reminder, we're interested in your comments specifically related to if a standard of care enforcement model is feasible and appropriate in the regulation of non-pharmacist licensed personnel.
This is the moderator, not the direction of the board or committee. I have opened up the Q&A feature for public comment. Members of the public, if you would like to make a comment on this item, please click the Q&A icon located at the bottom right-hand corner of your WebEx screen or use the raise hand function. I'll pause a moment to allow the public time to access the Q&A panel and submit their requests. All right, and seeing none, would you like me to close that Q&A panel?
Thank you, Sarah. Moving on to the next sub-question, example provided in there was about cold chain storage requirements found at a wholesale distributor to be reinforces my answer to the prior question. So any thoughts on this one, members? I don't believe this is okay. We're talking about cold chain storage. Sorry, the slide, I don't know if it's displaying the right slide there, but it still was subsection A, but sorry, yeah. Sorry.
Oh, hi. This is Eileen. I think the discussion, covered both A and B because I think both the members addressed both pharmacy techs and the other non-pharmacist license. So I don't think you have to go through each one of them if you don't want to.
Okay, I don't think that we need to do that. So I'm just gonna go to the members with examples and some of the additional subsection questions provided. Any other thoughts you wanna share before we move on? Okay, and one more thing. So next, Sarah, next slide, please. Sorry, it's a lot of words today and a lot of slides. Oh, we're not yet. So there's one more thing. So last, just specifically about pharmacy technicians. Under the law, pharmacy technician can only perform non-discretionary tasks under the direct supervisions and control. I do not believe a standard of care enforcement model is appropriate. So I just wanted to note for the record, especially given that they cannot apply any exercise professional judgment, what members' thoughts here are clearly reflected. So members, just specifically on the pharmacy technicians, specifically, if you could share your thoughts on the standard of care enforcement model for pharmacy technicians. I don't think that we need, any changes need to be made at this point. Maria? Okay, we're going along. All right, Renee?
Hi. Yes, so I would agree that there's no changes at this time, that the pharmacy technicians would be continue to operate under pharmacist discretion. So however that pharmacist was functioning, whatever if there's changes to that, but the technician would still be directed by the pharmacist.
Thank you, Renee. Jessie?
I agree.
Thank you, Jessie. Nicole?
Yeah, I think it's still appropriate for the the tech to operate under the direct supervision of the pharmacist. I think what we'll have to think about and take into account is if we expand the technician scope at all, And if we get into more things like, say, collaborative practice agreements for pharmacists, they will need techs to assist them. And that might look different than what techs are doing now. They'll still be under that direct supervision, but they may be doing other things. So as long as what we do incorporates that, I think it works.
Great point, Nicole. Thank you. And with that, we're going to go for public comment just on the specifically for pharmacy technicians portion.
This is the moderator, and at the direction of the committee, I've opened up the Q&A feature for public comment. Members of the public, if you would like to make a comment on this item, please click the Q&A icon located at the bottom right-hand corner of your WebEx screen or use the raise hand function. I'll go ahead and pause a moment to allow the public time to access those features and submit their requests. All right, and seeing none, would you like me to close that Q&A panel?
Yes, please. Thank you, Sarah. And here we are. Next question 3. This is a big question. Our next to consider is specifically related to pharmacists. Specifically, do we believe that pharmacists and PICs should continue to face potential discipline for violations of state and federal statutes and or standard of care breaches, or only if they breach the standard of care? Say it again, should continue to face potential discipline for violations of state and federal statutes and standard of care breaches, or only if they breach standard of care. I think this is probably one of the most important questions as we start writing the report. I believe that pharmacists must comply with the state and federal law and use professional judgment. It is not feasible to regulate to every possible scenario in the practice of pharmacy, which is why I also believe pharmacists as licensed professionals must follow a standard of care when the law does not specifically address an issue. Routinely, as I practice, I'm making clinical decisions for patients which are not defined in the law. But I believe pharmacists, along with all other licensees, must comply with the law as well. And so if the law is wrong, we need to change it. Having said that, I'll have additional comments in question 4 regarding where changes may be appropriate. So we're speaking strictly to this question, members. Do you believe where a pharmacist or PIC violates the law, should they face potential discipline or other if the individual breaches a standard of care? Again, I'm sorry that hopefully I'm not confusing people here. I feel like I'm playing at a court of law, playing with words. Not my intention, just trying to get to the bottom of the question at discussion at hand. So we'll start here with Nicole, I believe.
Sure. This is tricky because I think there's so many scenarios, but I think that a PIC and a pharmacist is where it actually makes sense to use standard of care. I don't know if we're talking about the example on the screen yet, example A about a Schedule II prescription, but I think all pharmacists will end up in a scenario at some point where you have to choose between doing what is strictly to the letter of the law and what is in the best interest of your patient, and makes the most sense to take care of them at that moment. I think using a Schedule II as an example makes perfect sense. And I think this is where using standard of care enforcement model makes sense if the pharmacist can demonstrate that what they did was the right thing to do for the patient that other pharmacists would have done in the same situation, even if it wasn't strictly the letter of the law. I think this makes sense here.
Got it, Nicole. Thank you. Maria?
I agree with Nicole that this is a little more challenging because there's so many nuances and different what ifs in here. And I think that's part of the pleasure that we're going to have for the rest of the day is talking about those nuances. So just kind of as an overview, I still have some differences from a pharmacist versus a PIC. And I think it goes back to the facility licensure, that there's additional requirements of the PIC to assure that the facility is following the law. And such that if there is an issue at the facility, the PIC is responsible for that and needs to maintain that responsibility. So that's not a way of putting all of the responsibility on the facility and not on an individual. The PIC still is responsible for that facility, and as such, their license may need to be looked at or disciplined based on a facility issue, depending on the situation again. But I guess just to start the discussion, to give everyone a little bit of information about my background, you know, I practice almost entirely in acute care. So I've been afforded, I'm just going to read what I wrote down, a few little notes, afforded a professional practice that has been part of a healthcare team, and often given the authority by physicians to use my judgment to prescribe, adjust, and monitor therapies. My experience and the experience of the individual and the practice norms for that community help to guide those judgments. And I think that that's where we're going to be discussing the bulk of our rest of our meeting. And so I look forward to that because that's an area that's near to me. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. Thanks for sharing. Renee?
Hi, thank you for your comments. So yes, this is where what they say, the rubber hits the road. This is very big, which is why we're all here. Yeah, I appreciate all your comments. Thank you, Maria, for that distinction there, kind of talking about when you're putting pharmacists who practice in a multitude of different settings and PICs who are responsible for licensed settings. So the potential discipline for violations of either what we already know, the state or federal regulations, and then this, you know, the proposed standard of care, which is not established or is being, you know, obviously is being discussed at this time. And so I would have to say that at this time, based on just knowing that there are pharmacists who work exclusively in dispensing functions, which falls very heavily on the regulations, but also would, you know, expand with standard of care. But then there are pharmacists who work hybrid positions. So for instance, you know, in many clinics or, you know, in my background in hospital settings, work in, you know, they may, you know, do some of the distributive type functions as well as, you know, work in clinics and have under collaborative practice agreements. So you could see them having those applications, but where they combined, like Nicole mentioned, like if a standard of care was conflicting with a statute, but it was in the interest of the patient, it looks like we might have some kind of third type of like requirements somewhere between a regulation and just a standard. I had to define that, but where, you know, possibly if it was a misjudgment that then harmed the patient, or then we'd have to look at what happens with that, right? So, I mean, at this time, I would have to say it seems that it would be some type of state, federal, and standard of care. Those would have to be applied to various settings. I'm not sure how we would accomplish that exactly, but that's why we're here. So
thank you, Renee. Thank you. Jessie?
Thank you, Sung. This is a loaded question. I'm going to try my best to stay focused on this because this can easily kind of branch out into some of the other questions that we have later on. I do think that, you know, a pharmacist could potentially be disciplined for a violation of standard of care and a health and safety code violation. That we already have that existing with C2s specifically, where, you know, we have, or controls in general, we have to practice corresponding responsibility, which is where the standard of care method comes in. But then say a person has hard copies that are not compliant under California law, that is a violation of that. So you have two separate regulations there. It does get a little tricky though if you have this sort of situation in which the two conflict. So if a pharmacist is arguing that they use their standard of care to do something that would violate a health and safety code, that's where it would get tricky. I don't know how that would go. And getting into a later question, but just to mention, it also kind of depends on who the pharmacists are who are setting the standard of care. I don't want to harp on that one too much. I go back and forth with the change by setting, like retail versus hospital. I will say, kind of bouncing on one of the comments that Maria Sherpa had mentioned regarding PIC responsibility for the facility. I think that would be appropriate in some circumstances, but my thoughts are in a chain setting, chain community setting specifically, that wouldn't necessarily be appropriate. As we saw from the survey results, a lot of pharmacists are indicating they don't have autonomy. So a lot of the pharmacists and PICs are operating with policies and procedures. They don't have the authority to hire or fire their personnel. And so I don't think more authority should necessarily fall on the PIC in that circumstance. I still think we need the facility in that specific circumstance to be accountable. And the other setting that I think of with standard of care that's concerning is compounding, of course. I think there needs to be very specific regulations in that circumstance, and there shouldn't necessarily be room for flexibility when, especially with sterile compounding, where patients' lives are at risk.
Thank you, Jesse. A lot of layers. We're all coming from all members here. A lot of layers. So just focusing on that first part is where we're hoping for some public comments as I open up. So just the first part, policy question number 3, pharmacists. Does the committee believe that pharmacists and PIC should continue to face potential discipline for violations of state and federal statutes and or standard of care breaches, or only if a pharmacist breaches a standard of care? So if we could open up public comment, I'm sure this will have a lot of our thoughts, and I am looking forward to hearing. So let's get started, Sarah.
All right, this is the moderator, and at the direction of the committee, I've opened up the Q&A feature for public comment. Members of the public, if you would like to make a comment on this item, please use the Q&A feature located at the bottom right-hand corner of your WebEx screen, or use the raise hand function. And it looks like we do have a request for comment from Dr. Adkins. Dr. Adkins, you'll be given 3 minutes to speak and a 10-second warning. Please click the unmute me button when the prompt appears on your device.
Hello, this is Dr. Christopher Adkins again, and I will speak specifically to my practice setting, which is chain community pharmacy. And I'll kind of echo what Jesse said, just about the autonomy that is afforded to the pharmacists. A lot of the time, the decisions that we, quote, make in the pharmacy aren't entirely our own because we're beholden to certain corporate policies that we're not allowed to violate or deviate from, as I said earlier. So that does affect the standard of care that we're allowed to provide. And I'll give one example specifically from when I worked at CVS. I was trying to change to a brand name medication, which was very expensive. And the computer system completely blocked me from being able to process the prescription at all when the patient was standing right there. So I had to tell the patient, I can't give you the medication. Even though it's sitting on the shelf, my computer system will not let me give it to you. She accused me of her denying her the prescription, which to a certain extent I was, because I couldn't give it to her, but it wasn't my fault. It was the computer system that was stopping me from giving it to her. So a lot of the time we are kind of handcuffed in a certain way, and we could be legally liable for something that isn't exactly our fault because our employer isn't allowing us to practice to a standard of care. We're practicing to the policies that we're allowed to practice to in our setting. And I'll keep it brief and just say that. So thank you.
All right, this is the moderator. It appears that was our only request for public comment.
Oh my God, okay, I'm surprised. Okay, well, thank you for the comment. I'm sure our commenters are waiting to comment on the subsequent questions. So, so the example provided, we're gonna go to the example part here in the question. Oh, not yet, Sarah, sorry. We're still on, yeah, for example, so the example provided, I just want to touch base on this specific example and just to gather everyone's thoughts. I think it was somewhat expressed, but I want to just go through one more time. So pharmacist dispensing Schedule II controlled substance that was not on the correct prescription form If in such an instance, should a pharmacist face potential discipline for the violation, or should testimony about how other pharmacists handle such prescriptions be enough to counter a violation of the statute? So that's the example here. And this is a very interesting example to me. At the heart of the question is, why do we have the law? The law controls substances, whether it's requirements about the prescription forms to be used or other legal requirements surrounding controlled substances, are in place for a very specific purpose: to protect patients and serve societal goals, to ensure the controlled substances with the potential for addiction are dispensed appropriately. And this is an example where a member of the board with responsibility as a decision maker over enforcement matters. And I would also say how the board would handle a specific scenario must be done on a case-by-case basis. So the facts in each case are different. A clinical decision to dispense or not dispense would be a factor of mitigation and aggravation. There's also the question of how pervasive is the violation. Did it occur in a single instance with a clinical rationale, or what is more prevalent? The board staff evaluate context in the decision on whether to utilize disciplinary accusation against the license or utilize an administrative remedy. Context matters in some of these situations. Ultimately, however, as I indicated previously, if the law is wrong, it should be changed, and those laws were passed by the legislature, with the board responsible for enforcing the laws passed by our elected officials. And like I can think of some other scenarios related to PICs not performing inventory reconciliations, or pharmacists not following protocols, or not providing consultations. I don't want to get bogged down to hypotheticals, but any other examples of scenarios just to kind of help bring the context in this discussion, members. So with that, I'm going to open up for one more time for our members first. Just speaking on that example of Schedule 2 controlled substance, just if you could add on to your any additional thoughts on there, and I'll start with Jesse.
I don't really have any additional thoughts, just going kind of what I said before. I do think a pharmacist should be held accountable both for standard of care and a violation of the Business and Professions Code, should the board choose to a standard of care.
Gotcha. Okay, Nicole, your thoughts?
I think this is tricky because, again, it depends on specifically what the issue is with the prescription. But I think most pharmacists have probably been in the situation where the doctor wrote the wrong date on a C2. They thought it was tomorrow. They wrote tomorrow's date, but the patient is out of meds. They are due for it. The cures looks good. They're doing everything they're supposed to. And you're left with the scenario where you have to either leave a patient without the medication that you know that they take regularly and that they need, or you have to wait a day and make them come back, possibly when they're disabled, to get this medication. And I think we've all seen that.
And of course, that happens on a Friday at 6 p.m., right?
Always a Friday. So they're going to have to wait till Monday. So you're going to leave them without their meds for like 72 hours. And those are the kind of scenarios where you would, I think, want to look at a standard of care, like where you're really doing the thing that is in the best interest of the patients, where you took all of the right steps, but you are technically potentially violating a health and safety code. And again, that's a very specific one, but it's fairly common. So that's where I lean towards going to a standard of care, though I'm sure there's other scenarios where I would not feel a standard of care is appropriate. And I don't know how we could have that discretion to say, in this case, standard of care is appropriate, but in this case, it is not. And that's where I get stuck.
Right. That's the challenge. Thank you, Nicole. Great point. Great thoughts there, Maria.
I agree. This one is a really tough one because it is going to be so case specific and also looking for patterns and trends. So I think that, of course, we were going to have to require lots of documentation and not just have someone recall potentially months or years later what was their thought. So documentation is going to be key to figure out what did the person think at the time, not necessarily what do we know now, because at the time you may not have all the information and you would make a different decision in the future, but at the time that's the decision that you made and it may be justified at the time, but tomorrow new information comes up that makes it not so justified. But also, looking at patterns and trends. But I think we also need to be careful because I'm thinking about other things that I've experienced where oftentimes it can be used as patient safety or patient care is used as an excuse for convenience. So, are we going to, so the extreme example would be, the doctor is now calling in prescriptions for morphine because of a convenience issue versus a true patient care issue where the patient needs it immediately. And, would that be justified as, and all of a sudden you have a pattern where 10% or 15% of their C2 prescriptions are coming in as verbal orders. Well, those are not exceptions anymore. Now you have a pattern or a trend. The other thing that concerns me is the opposite end, where I've been on the opposite end where a physician is adamant that, well, pharmacist Jane or pharmacist Joe does this for me, why don't you? And then they add that extra pressure. Whereas the standard may be different for this patient situation, and then the pharmacist's judgment and experience may be different for that situation. So we want to also help the pharmacists. This would require a lot of education and maybe role playing and scenarios with pharmacists to figure out what is the best way to deal with the situation to provide patient care in a safe and efficient manner without creating drift and underground processes. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. Renee?
Yeah, thank you for your comments. I would have to also agree and kind of second those that there would certainly be circumstances where either could be either of the sorry, lost my thought here reading through this. Yeah, it could be by regulatory and also the standard of care type model so that the pharmacist can really do the best thing for the patient, because sometimes the regulation is really not going to be for the best interest or safety of the patient. So I do think that both of those would apply.
Really great comments, everyone. That's very helpful, and I do agree in concept of all the thoughts that's being shared here. So then we're going to go for public comments.
This is the moderator, and at the direction of the committee, I have opened up the Q&A feature for public comment. Members of the public, if you would like to make a comment on this item, please click the Q&A icon located at the bottom right-hand corner of your WebEx screen or use the raise hand function. It looks like we do have a request for comment from individual identified as Rita Shane. Rita, you'll be given 3 minutes to speak and a 10-second warning. Please click the unmute me button when the prompt appears on your device.
Thank you. Appreciate the comments made by others. I'm Rita Shane, Vice President and Chief Pharmacy Officer at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. I think some of the guiding principles that might help as we navigate these types of issues is the risk of harm significant to the patient? Were there other factors that were at play? I think that has been articulated by a number of you members of the board in making these sorts of determinations. The concern that I'm having, and I think we all have, which is why we're having this discussion, is that where pharmacy has, in some ways, is treated very punitively compared to other healthcare professions, because we are between the order and the patient, and if we don't get it right, there is going to be harm. But there are a lot of nuances in the laws that, yes, they're if interpreted black and white, it's always going to be something that's going to require some sort of citation or other sorts of disciplinary action. And I would think we would be served by looking at guiding principles around, is this a recurrent event? Would there have been immediate patient harm? Those sorts of like risk points in helping to establish what the standard of care decision-making is, as again, it has been voiced very well by others. I would hate to think us going in the wrong direction when we create, harm, fear in pharmacists and other healthcare professionals. We don't get reporting. We can't assess opportunities for improvement, and we can't even identify physicians who are demanding that pharmacists take actions that are against their better judgment and interfere with the ethical practice of pharmacy. So my overarching recommendation is, let's look at this in the context of how do we enable the pharmacist to do the right thing at the right time for the patient to prevent harm, and how do we prevent the unintended consequence of creating a punitive environment that will disable us from identifying opportunities to help support the safe practice of pharmacy in the state of California. Because we want reporting and we want communication and we want pharmacists to feel that we support them both within the practice side as well within the state board to do the right thing for our patients in the context of that patient. Thank you.
Okay, this is a moderator. We'll move on to our next individual who has requested public comment. Daniel Kurda, I apologize, Kirdirshov. You'll be given 3 minutes to speak in a 10-second warning. Please click the unmute me button when the prompt appears on your device.
This is Daniel Kudryshov. Apologize about my raspy voice. I'm a medication safety officer. I'm a pharmacist at Keck Medical Center of USC, so in the acute care setting. I'm speaking as an individual, and I just wanted to chime in quickly and share my thoughts about standard of care and the difference between standard of care and more of a prescriptive regulation. In my mind, a standard of care, the way I look at it, the standard of care means that a pharmacist abides by all federal and state regulations and laws. So they're not mutually exclusive. In my mind, they actually support each other. And standard of care goes a little bit more beyond and covers the areas that are not, specifically regulated by a law or a statute or regulation of any kind. So I would expect, under standard of care model that, as a standard of care, I would expect everyone, every licensed pharmacist, pharmacy technician, whoever, every licensed individual to abide by all laws and regulations. That's a standard of care. So the debate whether, the law applies, or if we hear testimony that everyone else is not following the letter of the law, therefore that becomes a standard of care. That doesn't, I don't agree with that. I don't see that as a good rationale at all. If there's a law or regulation, it's black and white. You have to follow it. It's more restrictive, right? It's specific. You have to follow that. I think all pharmacists kind of live by that. And the standard of care would govern, in my mind, those situations that are not explicitly governed. So, and like everyone said, you can't regulate all aspects of pharmacy. I mean, and once we get into the clinical scenarios about what's best for the patient, the letter of the law can't regulate the pharmacist's actions. The pharmacists have room to utilize their professional judgment, and that's where the standard of care sort of applies, in my mind. They support each other. They're not mutually exclusive. So I just wanted to chime in and mention that. Thank you.
All right, this is the moderator. We'll move on to our next individual who has requested public comment. Individual logged in as GK. GK, you'll be given 3 minutes to speak and a 10-second warning. Please click the unmute me button when the prompt appears on your device.
I want to just echo what Nicole said regarding the scenarios where sometimes pharmacists do have to take their own professional judgment when prescribing medication, because mine was a real case scenario where I had my appointment at UC Davis. They were supposed to give my medication before I was to go out of country. But 2 days later, still no prescription was sent from UC Davis to the pharmacist. And unfortunately, pharmacists couldn't do anything because they're bound by the so-called laws, which is written by people who have no idea what is happening in ground related to the consumer. So I have to go out of country without my medication. And when I get back to UC Davis, all they just say, sorry, I didn't know that you needed it on that day. Oh my God. I went for an appointment that day asking foreign medicine to be prescribed. That is the very reason, right? So you see, poor pharmacist is in trouble because some doctor somewhere didn't get the message from his own staff at a UC Davis, which is supposed to be one of the best medical facilities they call themselves, which is not as per me. So I'm saying the pharmacists need some protection. As a consumer, the ground reality law is not always right on everything. So there's certain things that the board needs to do to help the pharmacists to make some judgment call. Like I say, I can show my ticket, at that time. I need just a basic BP medicine, right? And unfortunately, they couldn't do anything. They tried they faxed the information to the doctor's office, no response to it. On Saturday night was my flight, so there was nothing I could do. And for almost 2 months, I was without a medication. So you can understand if it's people who are going out of country, if this is an issue, and it could be out of state also. So the pharmacists need some protection, and the board needs to do something to make sure that the pharmacists are not held responsible for everything which the so-called law prescribes or promotes. Thank you.
Thank you.
This is the moderator. Our next individual who has requested public comment logged in as Joe. Joe, you'll be given 3 minutes to speak in a 10-second warning. Please click the unmute me button when the prompt appears on your device. This is the moderator. Joe, you'll need to click the unmute me button when the prompt appears on your device. It'll unmute your microphone. I'm going to request to unmute. Oh, there you go.
I believe that we should follow standard of care. One of the reasons is laws sometimes need to be changed and they're outdated. And by the time it changes, people can be prosecuted for a law that's outdated. As an example, USP went into effect in 2000. USP 797 went into effect in 2008, but it took all the way to 2020 for the California board to adopt it. Yet people were getting prosecuted because the California laws were not advanced enough to be with the level of the standard of care, which is USP. So that is one reason. And there's many other reasons. And, if California is the only one that has a law, such as, for instance, methylcobalamin, you cannot compound, but it's done all over the United States. You have to wonder, and the FDA doesn't have a problem, is this, the standard of care has gone direction towards methylcobalamin, yet people are getting prosecuted. The patient is being hurt because they're not getting the medication, and a lot of people cannot methylate cobalamin. It's used for autism, and the patient is suffering. So this is why its standard of care should be there. And it also should be, before any prosecution, you should have a pre-enforcement meeting so that this can be explained to board members, and let board members understand this. Once this goes to the Attorney General, it's gone. It costs $250,000 to defend yourself. So a lot of these laws are outdated sometimes, or just not right. And they will change with time, and the board does change with the time. But that's one example. Thank you.
This is the moderator. Our next individual who has requested public comment, Nathan Painter. Nathan, you'll be given 3 minutes to speak and a 10-second warning. Please click the unmute me button when the prompt appears on your device.
This is Nathan Painter. Sorry for not introducing myself earlier. Nathan Painter.
I apologize, Nathan. It's really hard to hear you. Is it possible that you can get closer to your microphone?
A little bit. Is this any better?
Much better. Thank you.
All right. So I apologize for not introducing myself earlier. My name is Nathan Painter. I work for UC San Diego, but I'm speaking as an individual. I just wanted to remind the board specifically to the C2 question, when there was a security pad printing issue that required specific action by the Board of Pharmacy to allow for the security pads to be accepted would have been a situation where if standard of care were in effect, those exceptions could be made on a faster point, right? So technically every prescription for a period of time from that certain printer was invalid. And in a standard of care model, things like that could be easily remedied by accepting them and verifying or, doing their due diligence in those situations. So thank you.
All right, this is the moderator. It appears that was our last individual who has requested public comment. Would you like me to close that Q&A panel?
Yes, please. Thank you. So we're going to go to one more subsection question under question 3. So the question is, actually, and before I go there, members, any thoughts on? Okay, next question. So do you believe your answer to the prior question changes depending on the practice setting? So me personally, I really don't want us to even go there in trying to say certain practice setting matters. I just want to be mindful that pharmacists are professionals treated in the same manner, irrespective of their setting. I don't want to dissect any further. So if changes are warranted by practice setting, I believe those changes should be reflected in the operative law, such as like ratios or health facilities for technician ratios for health facilities versus a chain pharmacy or something along the line. But I personally don't believe that the setting should change the answer to the question. Members, appreciate your thoughts, and I'll start with Maria.
I just wanted to bring up one issue here because it's kind of big, but I don't have a real understanding of how to deal with it. So I'm just going to say it, and it has to deal with the PIC's ability to be autonomous and to have the authority to control the licensed entity that they are responsible for. It makes me a little concerned that depending on the practice setting per se, that the PIC may be quote unquote less responsible because of corporate issues. That could be true of not just chain pharmacy, but there are corporations that own hospital chains or other corporate pharmacy practices that are beyond just chain. So I think that issue is kind of touched in here. I think we're going to talk about it someplace else also, but that's the part that I would prefer not to have a practice setting difference. But if PICs are practicing differently in the different practice settings, I think that is the issue. PICs should have the same autonomy and responsibility no matter what the practice setting is. That may be a naive statement because it seems like that's not true.
That's a great point, Maria. Great point. Thank you for bringing that up. Renee?
Yeah, I would kind of echo what both you and Maria have said, which is that I don't think that there should be varying analysis based on settings, because clearly settings don't fall into neat little categories. And I think overall, I mean, when keeping it just to pharmacists, I mean, pharmacists are, professionals, highly educated in all of those settings. So I do think that it should apply equally in all settings.
Thank you, Renee. Jessie?
Thank you. I think Maria really hit the nail on the head with what she said previously. I don't think this analysis specifically should change by setting. It is concerning, though, how drastically different the autonomy of pharmacists is between settings. So I think that is something to keep in the back of our minds during this discussion, but very complex issue.
Absolutely. And Nicole?
This is tricky. I agree that ideally they should all be the same, but if we were using a standard of care, would the basis of that standard of care be based on the practice setting, because they are different, and and whether or not we want them to be. So I think we would have to take that into account. You know, an ambulatory care setting is very different than a retail pharmacy, is very different than a hospital. So would that standard of care be based on your setting? And I don't know the answer to that, but just something to keep in mind. Maria makes excellent points about the PIC. And maybe this is better for another point in this discussion, but if we're moving to standard of care, we have to also think about how that reflects on the PIC. If a pharmacist working under a PIC makes a choice and the PIC didn't necessarily weigh in on that, but they're responsible for it, how does that play out? Do we give the PIC room to give the pharmacist discretion or to limit that discretion? So I think that plays into how it reflects back to the PIC as well. That's it.
Thank you. Thank you, Nicole. And I just want to add, you know, I think we also want to be mindful. I don't ever want pharmacists in certain situation to be like change that situation as well. So I don't want us to do anything that would kind of make people feel that that's the only opportunity they have. Obviously, that's not our mandate, but I mean, I don't think that that's my also some concerns of unintended consequences during this discussion. I want to be mindful of. So we're at 10:45. Oh, sorry, got to go public comment, and then we're gonna take a break. So, Sarah.
This is the moderator, and at the direction of the committee, I've opened up the Q&A feature for public comment. Members of the public, if you would like to make a comment on this item, please click the Q&A feature located at the bottom left-hand corner of your WebEx, or right-hand corner of your WebEx screen, or use the raise hand function. And it looks like I do have a request from Dr. Adkins. Dr. Adkins, you'll be given 3 minutes to speak and a 10-second warning. Please click the unmute me button when the prompt appears on your device.
And I would like to agree wholeheartedly with what Maria said initially. This is a very complicated subject, but as she said at the end, the abilities of the PIC shouldn't change based on practice setting. And I would say it does change in the way that we have pharmacy practice and healthcare set up right now. And that should not be the case. So maybe this discussion doesn't fall under what we're talking about right now. I do think it is something we should talk about very specifically, maybe not related to this, but it is something very important that we really need to recognize and not discount, that PICs don't have the same authorities in all settings. And in regard to standard of care, I would say absolutely that the standard of care does change based on your practice setting. Like in retail, I'm not handling rocuronium or anything like that. We handle different drugs, we have different specialties. I'm not an oncology specialist or anything like that. So I wouldn't be making any decisions regarding oncology drugs because I don't specialize in that. That's not my standard of care. So we do need to take into consideration that also. So I think taking into consideration both the decreased autonomy that we've seen in the questionnaire from earlier that retail pharmacists have, that might be something that we need to address maybe even separately to see if companies should be able to kind of handcuff the standard of care that pharmacists are able to provide, and also maybe assess separately what the standard of care is in each setting to see what type of decisions a pharmacist is able to make in their own setting, which should be left up to the pharmacist because it varies based on their education, whether they have a residency or some kind of specialization or a certification in a specific area. It's going to vary, and it is going to be something very difficult that we're going to have to develop over time as well. So it is a complicated subject, but the abilities and rights of a PIC should not change based on your practice setting. And right now it does. So I think that's something very important we need to keep, not in the back of our mind, but in the front of our mind, because that is something very key. Thank you.
All right, this is the moderator. It appears that was our only request for public comment. Would you like me to close the Q&A panel?
Thank you. Thank you for the comment. And so it's 10:48. We'll take a break. We've been at this for almost 2 hours. Time is flying by. So we'll take a break for about 10 minutes. We'll come back at 11 o'clock even. So you see you at 11. And I think Renee is coming back. Okay, I'll take a quick roll call. Maria?
Present.
Thank you, Maria. Renee?
Present.
Thank you, Jesse.
Present.
Thank you, and Nicole.
Present.
Thank you, and I'm here. Okay, back to the questions. Question 4. So we have received a significant, sorry, the slide shows not the question, Sarah. We have received significant number of comments and responses indicate that there are many who believe an expansion of the scope of practice for pharmacists is appropriate. Sorry, Sarah, the slide is not at the question. As
Apologies.
I mentioned at the beginning, at times there seems to be a mixing of the two concepts. I understand that if the detailed protocols around some of pharmacists' clinical duties are eliminated, then the enforcement for breach of providing such care will be dependent on proving a violation of standard of care. So next for our consideration is if we believe there are specific provisions included in the scope of practice that currently require compliance with specific pharmacy statutory provisions or regulations that would be appropriate to apply a less prescriptive authority, more like a standard of care model. And I personally believe absolutely, and there are ample opportunities to be less restrictive. As an example, the current protocol for naloxone is way too restrictive for pharmacists. For people who may not be tracking activities by the licensing committee, the committee will be recommending changes to the protocol to confirm with recent statutory expansion, but still it will be based on protocol. As part of the changes, it is anticipated that the regulation will also be streamlined where statute allows. So again, reminder, we can only do regulation based on what the statute allows. So I also want to note that at a board meeting later today, a presentation will be provided to members about a survey regarding implementation of pharmacist-provided HIV PrEP and PEP and PrEP. The results of this survey may be helpful to understand where there are barriers to implementation for our future consideration. I think our discussion needs to be balanced with a recognition that pharmacists in some settings may not currently have autonomy or time to make the patient care decisions too. So that would be required under a true standard of care model. As we discuss this, I think we need to be mindful of that dynamic and incorporate sufficient provisions to ensure autonomy in decision-making by a pharmacist rather than corporate management in the provisions of clinical pharmacy services. So with that, members, I will start with Renee on this.
Hi, yeah, thank you. I'm formulating my thought here. Actually, can you come back to me?
No problem. I will go to Jesse.
Hi, thank you, Sung. So I do agree that I think the concept that the pharmacist role would also be expanded under standard of care model is legitimate. My only concern is that couple of concerns actually. So number one, but one of the biggest kind of red flags in the survey is that community pharmacists also often feel like they don't have enough support. So they feel like they're overworked and understaffed in order to provide patient care. So that is a little concerning specifically to the community setting. I know that our survey didn't necessarily divide it up into chain versus independent, so I'll just leave it as what the survey results had. I also just don't think that every pharmacist is necessarily the same. So I know under standard of care, it's based on someone's experience. Even within the same company, two pharmacists don't necessarily have the same experience or training and therefore won't necessarily practice the same. So that's where things get a little bit tricky for me. And with corporate owned pharmacies, my other big concern is that pharmacists are going to be pressured to take on these added roles that they aren't necessarily comfortable doing. And I know that obviously it's up to whoever owns that business to decide what they want performed there, but I encounter that a lot personally with pharmacists who feel comfortable with one patient care service, but not necessarily another, even just based on population at, if they're at one pharmacy for X amount of years, that's all geriatric patients, they may feel comfortable doing one patient care service versus if you move that same pharmacist to a store that's completely pediatric patients, it's going to be a whole other thing. So yeah, this is a tricky one for me, but I do think that it does provide the opportunity to expand the roles. And I think that's overall a good thing in theory, but we have to keep working conditions in mind as we navigate this.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Great point. Nicole?
Yes, I think these kind of examples that we're looking at here under subsection A are exactly the kind of things that make sense for standard of care. PEP and PrEP, the regulations and requirements for those have changed significantly over the last few years since their inception and are expected to in the coming years as well. So having a standard of care model so that we can adapt to those without having to go back and change the regulations makes sense. We can see this with smoking cessation, with naloxone, with all of these things. So I think changing these to standard of care is just going to be better for our patients long term. To Jesse's point, I think we do have to work something into this, though, that says just because we're moving to a standard of care and offering these things doesn't mean a pharmacist has to do it. So I don't know how that works, but it does sound like we need to, because you're right, Jesse, my pharmacists know HIV like the back of their hand. They're going to do that all day and all night. But yeah, if pediatric patient shows up and we don't know what to do with them, that's not the clientele we serve. So I think there does have to be consideration for your area of practice and kind of time spent in that. So that's it. Thanks.
Great point, Nicole. And I mean, the perspective I want to offer is I've had my own situations where maybe a prescriber that you have, they may work in the same practice, but I have encountered a prescriber one is okay prescribing a certain medication. A prescriber two in the same practice would just say, no, I don't feel comfortable prescribing that medication. I don't know enough. Can that same B really stand on its feet in the setting of pharmacy where sometimes corporations, have a very widespread standardized marketing, whatnot, and then a pharmacist is forced to follow along just to, meet the corporations, whatever that may be. So great points, both of you. Thank you. Appreciate your thoughts. Maria, your thoughts?
Very complicated. I hope that this is kind of in an order because I changed kind of some of my comments based on what the others have said. And so it may be a little out of order here, but I agree that these or I don't know if you'd even call them traditional prescriptive authorities that were put into regulation were a tool of the time. They were because you needed a collaborative practice agreement, and many places and practice settings found that difficult to do. So having a statewide protocol practice agreement was to provide the opportunity for pharmacists to provide these treatments without necessarily having their own agreement. And so it appears that if we are to move forward with standard of care, then that tool is no longer necessary. We don't need all of those details of creating essentially statewide collaborative practice agreements because that's would be under standard of care. Now, with that said, there are some benefits to having some sort of documented standard practice because there are, some of the concerns I would have is like the professional requirement of having the education of training to provide those treatments or those services would be back to the pharmacist and the professional responsibility. They should know if they're educated and trained or get the training that's required to provide that. It should not, that should be part of what is the standard of care is if you are providing this, then you have the tools and the skills that you need. you have the monitoring forms, you have the screening criteria and all those kinds of things. That would be helpful. It's also helpful when you're looking at larger practice settings where you're sharing the patient monitoring responsibility amongst a group of pharmacists, that they have a shared documentation system and a shared process, so that pharmacist A doesn't do it one way and pharmacist B does it in another way, and it really depends on the day that the patient shows up or the day of the patient's appointment, that they get different different treatment protocols, I guess you would say. But going back to the pharmacist professionalism, I don't think, we just have to be clear, but I don't think there should be an implied intent that all pharmacists have to do everything all the time. It's based on their experience, their comfort, and that would be very similar to like physicians. There are some physicians who prescribe and monitor warfarin, and there's some that do not. There's not something that says all physicians must be able to prescribe. There's nothing. They stay within the parameters of their experience and their expertise. With that said, pharmacy is a little bit different, especially if you have drop-in appointments or those kinds of things. You need to be able to provide the service when the patient shows up, or have an appointment system, which would be another way of making sure that the service is there when the patient comes, such that you have someone who is not able to provide that service and the patient shows up would not be appropriate either. So going around and around, but the last thing that I wanted to share was I am have a little bit more concerned, and I'm not sure how to do this, is we've included some CE requirements on some of these things, and maybe that's also gone the way of the dinosaur, and we don't have CE requirements based on certain practice protocols, because now that's a professional judgment requirement. So as a professional, I know I'm providing vaccinations such that I know that I get certified for vaccinations, and I know that I do these CEs for that. And that's all about my professional judgment and not having it actually be dictated in the regulation. So like I said, my arguments appear to be circular, but I think I'm looking forward to hearing the discussion.
Thank you, Maria. I just want to say everyone's comments, it just shows all of you have studied this concept and really thought through. I just truly appreciate it. And thank you. Another great, comments. Thank you. Renee, are you ready?
Hi, yes, thank you. This is but as everybody's mentioned, this is very complex, and the practice of pharmacy is so variable. So when I'm looking at this, I'm just seeing, I know settings that I could not walk in and practice. And so I would appreciate like some, like a well-defined, set of parameters with which to do that. If, let's say, if I was to transition to something else. So I'm just trying to imagine that. So I do think that this is so complex, but yeah, I just can't even decide at this point how to quite answer that, except for that I think that the standard of care would definitely be able to be implemented in the settings where there's the training and the knowledge. But I think somebody who, I forget who mentioned this, maybe Maria, steps in to try to do the same function is maybe not going to be able to. So I'm not sure how that is taken care of in some not specialty pharmacy, but specialty settings. So there may need to be some, regulatory type framework in addition to like some of the standard of care that would be established.
Thank you, Renee.
Can I add one more thing?
Yeah, go ahead. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, I don't
Jesse. Go ahead, Jesse.
Oh, yeah.
Then we'll go to Maria.
So I think Maria brought a good point up about the CE requirements. And I think that's an interesting topic of discussion that we can look more into. I personally like the CE requirements for certain certifications, so I would be okay keeping it. The other thing too is I agree that pharmacists don't have to get certified or practice all of these patient care services. But the reality is that a lot of corporations do add on more services as they continue to be approved. So I think that's something we need to keep an eye out and potentially look into having some language to have pharmacists use their professional judgment in terms of getting certified and providing these services.
Thank you, Jesse. Maria?
Thank you. I just wanted to add two more things because I heard from both Renee and from Jesse some interesting concepts that I hope that members of the public would talk about too. The first one is having that service available during specified times. That might be something that we could talk about as having a regulatory component. Similar to we currently have regulations regarding contraception or other types of controversial treatments that require the workplace to either have someone who's able to provide the service or be able to provide the patient immediate access to that kind of service in an alternative location. So that kind of regulation may be something to consider, such that, you know, the patient needs PEP and PrEP and you walk into the pharmacy, they have either someone there or they send you someplace that can do that immediately. That's not something that you come back on Monday kind of thing. That would be something. The other one I think that Jesse mentioned was about corporations maybe requiring certain certifications. And I think that that could happen because that happens in non-healthcare settings where maybe it's your job and your job description says you shall perform these functions. You will do IV processing, you will do floor checks, you will do, you know, whatever the things are that you would do. It happens out there in non-healthcare environments. You know, you will know how to use the stove, you will know how to mop the floor, you will know how to, so if it's in your job description, that's something that should be discussed in advance of employment so that you know specifically what are the roles and requirements and not have it be a surprise later or an add-on, as Jesse said. It would be something that, you know, if you're not qualified for the job, then maybe they need to hire someone else. But if those are the qualifications they're looking for, then that should be something that's agreed upon before employment.
Great thoughts. Great
Yeah,
thoughts.
kind of going back off of that, Maria. Yeah, I agree, and I think most job descriptions probably have some sort of caveat of like, you know, continuing education and language of that sort. I just think it's difficult for a pharmacist to be an expert in everything, right? Like I'm by no means an HIV expert and therefore not very comfortable doing PEP prep necessarily. I do feel very comfortable in travel, but I think, yeah, it's a lot of nuance and specificity that I think it's hard to be an expert of everything, I guess. That's it.
Right, right. Nicole, do you want to jump in? Go ahead. I see you raised your hand.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to say, you know, we're talking about these issues with particularly corporate chain retail pharmacies requiring pharmacists to perform like multiple functions and areas of expertise under a standard of care model, but it's my understanding that's already happening. So that problem already exists. So I wanted to throw out, this sounds like a crossover to our med error committee and kind of like what we're exploring there. So maybe there's room for part of this discussion in that committee, or if we're working towards standard of care, working on some of those kind of regulations or pieces in other committees that we have in other areas.
Thank you, Nicole. Thank you for bringing that in there. And absolutely. So with that, I think we're ready for public comment. This one I'm expecting a lot, but maybe my anticipation will be incorrect again. But
This is the moderator, and at the direction of the committee, I've opened up the Q&A feature for public comment. Members of the public, if you would like to make a comment on this item, please click the Q&A icon located at the bottom right-hand corner of your WebEx screen, or use the raise hand function. And it does look like we have a couple individuals, so I'm going to start with the Q&A first. Oh, lots of hands. Okay. I will start with the Q&A first. So I have a request from Daniel Robinson. And Daniel, you'll be given 3 minutes to speak and a 10-second warning. Please click the unmute me button when the prompt appears on your device.
Emeritus, Western University of Health Sciences. First of all, the question starts by saying many commenters have suggested that standard of care is a means of expanding scope of practice, and I don't believe it. I've attended all of these sessions, and I don't really see that as the case. Pharmacy is a very diverse profession, and we have the Board of Pharmacy Specialties recognizes 14 different specialties. I was happy to hear Maria talk about her practice in acute care and the amount of autonomy and the number of things she's able to do. If you look at according to the healthcare provider taxonomy, among other things, pharmacists provide acts or services necessary to provide medication management in all practice settings. So, and obviously not all pharmacists are providing medication management in all practice settings, but there's any number of specialties. And what we need to think about is once we became healthcare providers, we have to think about what does that really mean? It doesn't mean practicing according to a protocol. It doesn't mean practicing according to a collaborative practice agreement. There are skills and knowledge and abilities that pharmacists have that are unique to our profession. And we're very qualified in many areas to provide medication management and preventative healthcare services. So this is not about expanding practice. This is really about creating a regulatory environment that allows those that are practicing in oncology, for example, and they're involved in decisions regarding therapy. If there's a quality of care issue that results from those settings, standard of care is the way that needs to be addressed. If you look at the literature, there's professional standard of care, and then there's legal standard of care. And the board and pharmacy law really focuses on legal standard of care, what pharmacists are allowed to do and what they're not allowed to do. And there's really no other health profession that is so tightly regulated. We need to be recognized as healthcare professionals, and we need to be able to practice to the full extent of our license. And that's based on individual training and education. And in terms of setting, there's community pharmacists can certainly also be board certified in a specialty area. There might be an independent pharmacy that focuses on diabetes management. So we don't want to restrict it by setting, but really on the skills and abilities of the pharmacist providing those services. Thank you.
10 seconds. Oh. All right. This is the moderator. We'll move on to our next individual who has requested public comment. Individual signed in as Kevin. And Kevin, you'll be given 3 minutes to speak and a 10-second warning. Please click the unmute me button when the prompt appears on your device.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. This is Kevin Komodo Pharmacy, Kern County. 2 comments. First comment was, I made a comment earlier during question 1 of this section in which I spoke about naloxone. I'm not quite sure how the minutes work, but if possible, I think that argument was best tailored for this part of the discussion. I wanted to, based off of the discussion that we just had, kind of expand upon that. I really liked what Maria and a lot of the members of the board were talking about as far as expansion. I think that there will be a need to have certain types of foundation set, like we talked about, like, professional requirements. But to Maria's point, maybe being able to not be so prescriptive about certain types of things like the CE requirements, because things are going to start to fall back towards, okay, are you performing within the scope of what you've been trained for? The idea about starting to specify times, I think, could be very challenging when I think about it from an implementation standpoint. And so, I think that, like I said, setting a good foundation, and then the next piece would be about empowering the pharmacist then to be able to make the decision about whether they can participate or not participate based off of their didactic training or the information that they have. I think that by empowering pharmacists in that way, that helps us to negate that concept of people being demanded to participate in some sort of a clinical function for which they do not feel that they have adequate training. I'll give you an example. I think that pharmacists already are a little bit kind of geared in this direction. And the example was Paxlovid, because when we were given the ability to be able to dispense this in the community setting, I could not find a single person that would want to do it. And all of us were looking at each other in the very same way, like, you know, based off of the information that we have in this particular setting, it can, like, I don't feel safe for my patients to be able to furnish this. Some of us tried discussing with our physicians and looking at other ways that we could be able to try to mitigate some of those issues. But, you know, ultimately it was the pharmacist that said, like, we really believe in providing access, but at the same time, we need to balance what's safe for our patients. So just to summarize what I was saying, I do really like moving towards a standard of care model. I do think that there's going to be some baseline standards that have to be set, but trying to get too picky about like CE requirements or specified times, I think is going to actually end up limiting the access as opposed to expanding the access and potential patient impact we have. Thank you.
All right, this is a moderator. We'll move on to raised hands, and I have Richard Dang. Richard, you'll be given 3 minutes to speak in a 10-second warning. Please click the unmute me button when the prompt appears on your device.
Hi, Richard Dang, President of the California Pharmacists Association. I want to thank the committee for their thoughtful conversation on this topic. I really do appreciate the thoughtful insight and consideration and just comments that have been made so far. I do want to take the opportunity to echo many of the comments actually that our committee members made, especially the ones from Maria and Jesse and Nicole. And I just kind of want to echo and respond to a few of those items and just point out again that standard of care, you know, really enables the pharmacist exercise of professional judgment, increases autonomy, and by no means does having a standard of care model means it would compel or require a pharmacist to provide various services. Additionally, we've all recognized that standard of care establishes the minimum competency that needs to be demonstrated in order to perform a certain service, and that needs to be tied over into the pharmacist's training, education, and ability. And I think it was there was comments made about the job descriptions being placed in there, and I would agree to many of those comments. And if a new service were to be added and implemented, I would believe that it is the employer's responsibility to provide the new added training and guidance to pharmacists to enable them to feel comfortable. And ultimately, it does need to be the pharmacist who communicates to their workplace or employer whether they are or are not comfortable providing a certain service. And then the employer can then provide the added training or guidance through various programs and education to help that employee feel comfortable providing those services if it is going to be a part of their future job description. And you know, having a standard of care model does not mean that pharmacists are expected to be experts in all things. And so very much echo Maria's comments that pharmacists do not need to provide all services at all times, and you're not expected to provide everything. And the final kind of comment that I would bring up is that Nicole's comment on working with the medication errors work group on some concerns tangentially related to standard of care would encourage the committee to consider that as well. But also pointing out that standard of care would also set a precedence for what would be a minimal acceptable working condition. If we have pharmacies who are providing, for example, diabetes management services, when we look at how that's being provided across the spectrum of variety of practice settings, a 5-minute walk-in appointment at a particular location may not be considered an appropriate length of time that could be dedicated to that diabetes appointment because the standard may have been established elsewhere that type of appointment or service would require at least, for example, 15 or 30 minutes, right? And so I do believe that standard of care would also enable to allow to establish those minimum working conditions to address some of those concerns. Thank you.
All right, this is a moderator. We'll move on to our next individual who has requested public comment, Dr. Adkins. And Dr. Adkins, you'll be given 3 minutes to speak in a 10-second warning. Please click the unmute me button when the prompt appears on your device.
Hi, this is Dr. Adkins again. I'm going to actually, Dr. Dang said almost exactly what I wanted to say, that I believe the standard of care would actually improve our ability to decide what and when we provide what services and when we provide services in the pharmacy. I know it is definitely a concern in retail pharmacy that we're just kind of told that we're going to start providing new services. Like I can think of travel medications recently that everyone in our company was just told that we needed to do the CE on and be ready to provide these services within like a week or two, while we're also working when we don't have time to do it. So we're rushed. We don't actually get the training we need, but technically on paper, we're certified to do it. So now we can. So now they can start charging for it as a company. But I think that the standard of care model will actually allow us the ability to say, hey, that training was not sufficient for me to provide these travel medications. I need additional training to practice to a standard of care. I need more training. It can't just be something on paper that says I can technically do this and we can start providing the services. So I'm just going to echo kind of what Dr. Dang said right there, that I think the standard of care is going to help in that part, but we do need to keep in mind that as additional pharmacy services come up, companies are going to want pharmacists to start providing those services because that's going to be an additional stream of income for them. So we need to focus on the care part of the standard of care and make sure that's the thing that's being improved here and not just the quantity of care that's being provided. And that might be something that we have to do kind of on the back end after we move to a standard of care and see how it's being provided, if it's being provided in a high quality way, and make sure that pharmacists are aware that they are the practitioner here, not their company, and the company can't tell them, you have to provide these services right now to this patient if we don't feel that it's in the best interest of the patient to do it. Or like Dr. Dang said, maybe a 5-minute diabetes consultation is not the standard of care that we should be providing. So I'll keep it right there and say that I just agree largely with what Dr. Dang just said.
All right, this is the moderator. We'll move on to our next individual who has requested public comment. Daniel Krudayashov, you'll be given 3 minutes to speak and a 10-second warning. Please click the unmute me button when the prompt appears on your device.
Hello. Hello again. Thank you. This is Daniel Kudryashov, Keck Medical Center of USC. Like everyone mentioned, I appreciate everyone's comments and also the opportunity to provide this commentary. I will, I think, echo what Dr. Daniel Rabinson mentioned, that I also agree that I don't see this as an expansion of pharmacist scope of practice at all. We're talking about a standard of care enforcement model that doesn't really define what the pharmacist scope of practice is. And as I mentioned before, if we look at the definition, at least from the National Association of Board of Pharmacy, for the standard of care is, or the proposed, I guess, standard of care there is the degree of care, a prudent and reasonable licensee or registrant with similar education, training, and experience will exercise under similar circumstances. And in my mind, prudent, reasonable licensee, number one thing that they have to do is abide with all federal, state laws and regulations, which defines the scope of practice. So in my mind, this is not a scope of practice expansion at all. I don't see it that way. I think the pharmacist will still be bound by all laws and regulations that currently define what a pharmacist may and may not do. So I also wanted to chime in. There was a comment about medication errors and the committee that the Board of Pharmacy, I guess the work that the Board of Pharmacy is leading there. And I wanted to draw a parallel. This was on my mind, and I'm still thinking about how to formulate this. But in my role at my employer, I'm a medication safety officer. And what I do is, whenever there's a medication error, I investigate the root causes for the medication error, and then we try to improve our system to make our health system better for our patients and safer for our patients, right? But part of that is also making a determination whether or not a pharmacist or a pharmacy technician who made an error, what disciplinary action to issue, if any. Inevitably, in most errors, there is also a violation. Most of the time, there's a violation of a a board of pharmacy regulation. If a pharmacist dispenses the wrong product, that's a violation. So if a technician, doesn't follow USP standards, that's a violation, and may or may not
10
lead to
seconds.
patient harm. But I would mention that that's an interesting correlation, and I think worth expanding further. And I hope to comment more on this. Thank you.
All right, this is the moderator. We'll move on to our next individual who has requested public comment. Lisa Kroon, you'll be given 3 minutes to speak and a 10-second warning. Please click the unmute me button when the prompt appears on your device.
Thank you very much. Lisa Kroon, Chair of the Department of Clinical Pharmacy at UCSF School of Pharmacy, and also an Assistant Chief Pharmacy Officer at UCSF Health. I am just really encouraged by the conversation at this part of the agenda and the very thoughtful discussion of the board members and your deliberations. For the statewide protocols, as has been stated, the standard of care approach would no longer really require these to be in place, which can get outdated quickly. And my example here that I didn't get to finish on was for our smoking cessation services. At the time of SB 493, Chantix had a boxed warning, and this was removed from the list of medications a pharmacist could independently prescribe. That boxed warning was removed in December of 2016. And so our existing statewide protocol is not effective and doesn't include a first-line medication to help treat tobacco dependence. To Jessica, to your point of being an expert of everything, absolutely. That's not the intent of standard of care. I'm a diabetes specialist. I would never prescribe HIV medicines. That's not my area of expertise. And that's actually what we're seeing in many of the chains. It's not every pharmacist doing everything, but certain ones picking up different types of services, such as smoking cessation, diabetes management, et cetera. And my final comment, as to community pharmacy practice and the existing less than optimal working conditions, we want our graduating students to see community practice as a desirable place to practice. And I really believe the standard of care approach will actually enhance that condition. We'll see more students wanting to go into community practice and to be able to practice at the top of their license. Thank you very much.
All right, this is the moderator. It appears that was our last request for public comment. Would you like me to close the Q&A panel?
Thank you, Sarah, but I'm just going to bring back to our members to ask if there's any additional thoughts after hearing some comments. And
This is Jessie. I just want to say I think this discussion is amazing. I really appreciate the robust conversation and hearing from pharmacists from all different practice settings, because I think that's helping us get a more well-rounded picture. I mean, granted, I'm still confused personally on which direction to go, but I think this has been a really wonderful discussion. So I appreciate that. And then I guess just following up on the comment we had made earlier, which I'm kind of forgetting because there's been a lot going on, but we wanted to refer something to the Med Error Committee. Is that something that we're able to do?
I think that Nicole and Ann, at the discretion of the chair, can do that. So I don't think we need to do anything other than to just please make a strong recommendation to Nicole and Ann to consider that.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Any other member thoughts? All right, so next question subsection is, so it's just a quick repeat. So do we believe that the practice setting makes a difference in this analysis? I personally, as I said, I do not want to approach it this way, but any members have any thoughts or changing their minds?
I think it could have an impact. I think, but kind of echoing some of the comments that were made, I think if we were to transition of standard care model, then something has to be done about working conditions, minimum staffing, other requirements that would allow for such services. So, but you know, the standard of care obviously is going to be different depending on the practice setting, but I think all of those things need to be factored in to a transition potentially.
Thank you. Thank you, Jesse. And I think Nicole, you had, yep, go ahead, Nicole. And then we'll go to you, Maria.
Thank you. Yeah, I was going to say, I agree with you as an enforcement model. It should not be separate, but the standard of care that it applies probably has to be relevant to the setting.
Very true. Yes. So maybe not as a law, but as a true standard of care. Maria?
I think similar to this, it's not really about the location, but it's about the advanced training of the individual. I think should be part of the discussion and could require either a higher standard of care for those that have advanced practice training or board certification versus those that have a lower standard of experience and training. I think those would all be things to talk about also.
Absolutely. Okay, with that little add-on, I'm going to open for public comment one more time. And Renee, did you want to add anything, or are you okay?
I'm okay. We were just having an earthquake. Okay.
Oh.
It's surprising. Anyway, yeah, I mean, just again, echoing what everybody's saying here, I would agree. I think that the standard of care model, there's, you know, we can talk about it as a very generic whole, but there's going to be obviously different models for so many different specialties, so to speak. But I do believe that, you know, implementation of that would definitely expand access to care. Again, yes, there's barriers in some of the settings in terms of, you know, who's driving that, but definitely could improve patient outcomes. And I think that sort of speaks to that, you know, possibly including the Med-Air committee to review or look further into that. Thank you.
Thank you, Renee. All right, Sarah, go for public comment one more time.
All right, this is the moderator, and at the direction of the committee, I've opened up the Q&A feature for public comment. Members of the public, if you would like to make a comment on this item, please click the Q&A icon located at the bottom right-hand corner of your WebEx screen or use the raise hand function. It looks like we have a couple individuals, so I'll start with the Q&A first. Daniel Robinson, you'll be given 3 minutes to speak and a 10-second warning. Please click the unmute me button when the prompt appears on your device.
Thank you. I'm going to only require about 20 seconds. I think that the practice setting, as you're dealing with a standard of care issue, the practice setting is one of the components that needs to be considered. For example, if you're looking at medical practice and you're in a community clinic, they should not be providing, you know, certain types of surgery in that clinic. There's certain settings where pharmacists should not be providing certain activities if it's not supported by that setting. So I think as we deal with a quality of care issue and under standard of care, the setting is part and parcel of the evaluation of any violation or problem that may have occurred. So, but we don't have to create separate rules for different, you know, a priori. We don't have to go there and define one setting versus another. That happens during the quality of or the standard of care process. Thank you.
All right, this is the moderator. Our next individual is Richard Dang, and Richard, you'll be given 3 minutes to speak and a 10-second warning. Please click the unmute me button when the prompt appears on your device.
Hi, this is Richard Dang, California Farmers Association. I'll be brief. I just wanted to agree with comments that were made by many of the committee members that from a broad perspective, the standard of care enforcement model should not be restricted to certain practice areas and it should apply to all practice areas equally. Thank you.
All right, this is the moderator. Oh, and we do have another request for comment from Daniel Kudirashov. And Daniel, you'll be given 3 minutes to speak and a 10-second warning. Please click the unmute me button when the prompt appears on your device.
Hello again, and thank you so much for the opportunity again. I wanted to chime in, and I think my last thought that I didn't mention actually aligns with this question. I was talking about medication errors and how we respond to them in the health system world. And there's a concept called just culture that we tend to adopt to be fair to the individual making a mistake and hold both the facility and the individual proportionally responsible for the error, and not only the individual. And a part of the algorithm is what's called a substitution test. And this is a very interesting comment that aligns with, I think, the discussion. And we ask, if in the circumstances that led to this questionable event, what would a different pharmacist do? A rational and prudent pharmacist in a different shoe, in different shoes, and be placed in that situation, what would they do? Could they make that same error or same judgment in those situations, right? And if the answer is yes, then we don't hold, or could be complicated, but in general, we wouldn't hold that first person accountable for their mistake, because it's, if another reasonable prudent pharmacist could make that mistake, then it could be a systematic issue that contributed. And I think how it aligns with this question is, should the standard be differently applied in different practice setting? I would say no, it should be the same, but with the understanding is that the standard of care is different for every setting. So when we apply the standard of care in an enforcement case, it should be understood that the standard of care is for that exact setting. So we can't compare standard of care in an ambulatory clinic to a standard of care to, acute care to just the community care. The standard of care needs to be defined within the context of those specific circumstances. It needs to be specific to that situation and specific setting. So I'm not sure how easily that is to define, in laws, regulations, but in my mind, standard of care is not a single standard of care. It actually, the standard of care for that institution, because every institution, quite frankly, can be somewhat different. So we need to keep that in mind, and I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
All right, this is the moderator. Appears that was our last individual who has requested public comment. Would you like me to close the Q&A panel?
Yes, please. Thank you. And I see Maria, your hand's raised. So Maria, go ahead. Share your thoughts.
Maybe just a summary statement after hearing board members and members of the public. It appears to me, and how I'm now processing this information, is that regulation should not be site-specific, person-specific, those kinds of specificities, but that the circumstances of the event that we're evaluating during an enforcement action or enforcement consideration, that those would be considered at that point and not in the regulation itself, but only in a potential enforcement action, if that's what I'm hearing people and our consensus going towards.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you for that. I think that's a great point. Any other thoughts? Okay, we're ready to move on to the next question, 5. Just FYI, I think we're probably going to run out of time, so we're going to have to cut somewhere, but I think we can go for one more question. So we're going to try for one more question. Question 5 next is, if we believe for expanded use of standard of care model for scope of practice, I know some may disagree, but I think that this is to be debated by the legal minds, not me. So could expand access to care or improve patient outcomes. So I believe myself there is a potential for great opportunity to expand access to care by expanding scope of practice. I believe the recent Advanced Practice Pharmacist Authority and the expansion of collaborative practice go a long way to expand access to clinical services for patients in California. For advanced practice pharmacists, their training and education goes well beyond pharmacy school education, which I believe is necessary depending on the breadth of expansion and autonomy we're considering. I'm proud of the pharmacy profession for stepping in to address access to care and appreciate all the efforts undertaken by industry groups and the profession as a whole. The work being done by Dr. Chen and his colleagues speaks to a significant role pharmacists can play in improving public health and patient outcomes. As we learned during the presentation at our last meeting, participants go through a robust training program. And so my question, I suppose, is how we replicate the model, if that's even possible, and make that into a reality for more parts of the state and hopefully for the country. I also recall Dr. Chen discussing like removing practitioners from the program if it's not a good fit. So when we think about this as a consumer protection agency, I believe one way the board could achieve such a prohibition is through disciplinary of the license. So this could potentially result in an individual losing their license. So it's a loaded question, a lot of thoughts. So we're gonna start this with Jesse. Jesse?
Thank you, Sung. So I agree. I think it has the potential to. I don't know that I've seen 100% that it would necessarily for everyone, because I do think it depends on the practice setting, even the pharmacy within community pharmacy. You know, within the same company, it may be different. Maybe expanding that practice or having people be certified, like we said, of course there have to be certain conditions that must be met in order to provide these services, but all of that will require a real revamping of the model that currently exists in the structure specifically of community pharmacy. But I do think, especially in these rural areas or these areas where they're pharmacy deserts, this has a real potential to improve access to care, which I think is really important. But it's all a little theoretical at this point, for me anyway.
Thank you, Jesse. Nicole, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that yes, it absolutely will expand access to care and improve patient outcomes. Now, I think those outcomes might look a little different in the different pharmacy settings. But to share at my own practice, over the last few years, we've added a clinical pharmacy program. Obviously, they're working under collaborative practice agreements, but we have had a massive improvement in our diabetic patients and their health outcomes and their A1C by having those managed by pharmacists. It is night and day difference from what we were seeing before, and that was in the span of like a 2-year period. So I've seen it. I also think we have to take into account that there's a huge shortage of medical providers in our state. However, there is not a shortage of pharmacists, or at least less likely to be a shortage of pharmacists. So this is where pharmacists can really step up and help patients when they can't get to a medical provider. There's so many disease states that are chronic, that are highly dependent on drug therapy, that having that increased access to pharmacists would help. Diabetes and high blood pressure cost the state tons and tons of money, much worse health outcomes, particularly in, communities of color and other marginalized groups. And here, I think this is a great chance to add some equity into the medical profession in the state.
Thank you, Nicole. Absolutely. Absolutely. Maria?
I agree that the potential is great and huge and somewhat exciting. I would also want to have some caution, just because in my experience, sometimes the best results aren't always what we see, and sometimes you have unintended consequences, and so we just need to monitor for that, where that the standard is not lowered in some area because the argument is, well, that's not the standard of care, so I don't need to do that anymore. And I was trying to think of some good examples, and I don't have really good ones, but the examples I did think of is maybe barcode confirmation of prescription is what's currently being done, but now that's no longer the standard of care, so I don't need to continue that process. So now I have a lower process. Or maybe the other one is we have a real challenge right now with patient consultation. And could it be argued that in some areas or in some locations or in some circumstances, whether it's drug specific or geographic, that the pharmacist would argue consultation is not required? And would that lower the standard of care more? Because currently we would encourage and recommend and actually enforce consultation. So I tread cautiously, but optimistically.
Thank you. Excellent points, Maria, as always. Renee?
Hi. Yeah, well, I mean, once again, thank you for all your comments. And I would, I really liked all that Nicole said, based on her experience in those types of settings and her view, that there definitely could be great expanded access, to care and in fact, seeing improved outcomes that pharmacists are perfectly capable of managing. However, probably needing a different environment under which to do that. So thank you.
Thank you, Renee. Any additional thoughts before we open up for public comment? All right, and we will open up for public comment.
This is the moderator, and at the direction of the committee, I've opened up the Q&A feature for public comment. Members of the public, if you would like to make a comment on this item, please click the Q&A icon located at the bottom right-hand corner of your WebEx screen, or use the raise hand function. Looks like we have a couple, so I'm going to start with the raised hands. Richard Dang, you'll be given 3 minutes to speak and a 10-second warning. Please click the unmute me button when the prompt appears on your device.
Hi, thank you. Richard Dang, President of the California Pharmacists Association. I do just want to bring to the attention of the committee several publications and references that do speak to situations where pharmacists being able to practice at the top of their license does improve patient outcomes. The two primary ones that I want to mention today is the 2011 report to the U.S. Surgeon General's office, and as well as the 2015 report from the National Governors Association. Both of these documents completed sort of a meta-analysis of the data that was out there, and really was able to pinpoint that pharmacists providing services at the top of their license were able to improve patient outcomes across a variety of different practice settings and across a variety of different disease states. And many of the studies that were looked at also were conducted in an outpatient community pharmacy setting. And I do also want to point out that one of the hallmark studies that really led to pharmaceutical care in the United States was the Asheville Project, conducted in 1997, which really did establish that pharmacists were able to be very effective in improving diabetes outcome. And they have now also shown long-term clinical and economic benefits. And within that Asheville Project, all of the sites that were conducted were completed in an outpatient community pharmacy setting. So I appreciate definitely the conversation there. And if the committee would like me to provide these documents for your review, I'd be happy to do so. Thank you.
All right, this is the moderator. We'll move on to Daniel Kudryashov. And Daniel, you'll be given 3 minutes to speak and a 10-second warning. Please click the unmute me button when the prompt appears on your device.
Thank you. Daniel Kudryashov here. I'll be brief. Wanted to mention something that just came into my mind. I'll preface this by saying that I'm not an attorney. I do have a degree in law, but I'm not an attorney. And what this discussion reminds me of is in enforcement cases, whether or not pharmacists will be held liable based on the premises of strict liability versus the need to prove negligence. And what it seems to me is that by moving towards a standard of care model for enforcement, the threshold for evidence would need to be to prove negligence as opposed to strict liability, and I think that is something to weigh in from maybe a legal perspective. But overall, I think regardless of that, I do still think that a pharmacist should follow all federal and state laws and regulations, even with the standard of care model in place. And I'll stop there. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Great, this is the moderator. We'll move on to our next individual who has requested public comment, Dr. Adkins. And Dr. Adkins, you'll be given 3 minutes to speak and a 10-second warning. Please click the unmute me button when the prompt appears on your device.
Hello, Dr. Adkins back again. I just wanted to comment on the 2 points in the question. Will moving to a standard of care increase access to care for patients? And I believe absolutely that is the case. I mean, we know that patients see a pharmacist more than they do a doctor. And we are the medication experts. While doctors are experts in diagnosis, we are the experts in the medication plan that the patient is on. And will this improve outcomes of patients? Absolutely. I know a lot of studies have been done showing that when pharmacists are driving the treatment plan for a patient, that does improve their outcomes because, like I said, we are the medication experts. And I will make a comment that I believe it's Singapore that has started to move toward I guess it's a standard of care model. I'm not sure exactly what they call it, but their pharmacists are leading basically clinics in the community where they manage a lot of the very simple disease states that patients have, like hypertension, cholesterol, asthma, just very simple things that can be addressed very early on and can improve a patient's health long term and prevent them from having things like strokes and heart attacks later on in their life. So I think it might be a good idea to maybe, if we could, contact someone from Singapore to have them maybe sit in on one of these meetings or kind of go over how they've been doing things for pharmacy in their country. Because from what I've been reading, it does seem like they have a very effective pharmacy practice that has evolved very quickly in their country. And I just wanted to make a note of that might be something that could really help out this conversation if we could get into contact with someone over there and have them come maybe speak at one of our meetings. Like I know someone from a Canadian pharmacist came and spoke at a meeting not too long ago. So that's just a comment that I wanted to bring up. Maybe we could look into that more and see how they've been doing this since they've been being so successful from what I can see in it. Thank you.
All right, this is the moderator. Appears I was our last individual to request public comment. Would you like me to close that Q&A panel?
Yes, thank you, Sarah. Thank you for the comments. And absolutely, if you could provide it to us, Dr. Dang, that would be great, as well as if we can connect with someone in Singapore. And if you could somehow score that, I don't know how you start that process, but if you know anything or article, whatever that may be, I think that it's fascinating to hear about that situation. So moving on to the second part of the question 5, which is to ask setting minimum requirements on training or education. I know Maria alluded to Jesse as well about CE, so it's kind of related to that question. To ensure baseline competency across the state is preferable, or to allow for deviations based on geography or size of practice or other variables. I said or specifically, not and. So believe we can look to advanced practice as a possible model. As we learned from Dr. Chan's presentation, extensive training is required to perform those advanced duties that he trains themselves, not as a legal matter, but as a practice matter. So I do not want to personally contemplate geographic differences. I think that that actually sets a very bad precedent. As we could have different levels of minimum care across the California or country, we do not want that. But we do need to advance patient care while ensuring healthcare equity. So members, we'll start with Nicole on this question.
I'm having a little bit of a hard time with this because from a patient protection lens, I lean towards having minimum requirements for everyone. But from a patient equity lens and access to care, I lean towards allowing deviations. You know, it's just the needs of each community is different. And you know, what we need in Los Angeles is going to be totally different than what they need in the more rural areas, and the patient populations look different. So I'm struggling a little bit. I probably want to hear a little bit what other people have to say. And then my second thought to this is about if we have, you know, like a set of requirements, but if someone's already an expert in an area, it feels like too much to make them do it again. Like, for example, all of the pharmacists at my practices are accredited by the American Academy of HIV Medicine. So having to do extra training to do PEP and PrEP would be very superfluous. Like, they could do that every day. But again, like if we were going to do pediatrics or something different, we would want to do some kind of training. So I think there has to be a little bit of room for, if you already have a specialty in something, can that be substituted for the requirements? So those are my initial thoughts.
Thank you, Nicole. Maria?
Interesting. Nicole caused me to think about something differently. So I appreciate actually listening to everyone's comments. I was going to talk about minimum standards, minimum requirements based on the education of the pharmacists. And those minimum standards are really done also through ACPE standardizations and certifications of our academic settings. And we have input into that as a board, but also, you know, as a community, those standards and those expectations are constantly growing and improving so that we have a better product out of the pharmacy schools. And that's something that we could also use as having helping to set our minimum standards and not necessarily make the board responsible for the minimum standards outside of the academic area. But then you mentioned about practice, redoing practice trainings. And what that really reminded me of, and I'm just going to, because I haven't really processed it through, I kind of feel like some of these things have to kind of resonate a little bit longer, is in my setting, we have what we call competencies. And some of them are reviewed periodically to assure there's no drift and that we all have the same common understanding. And so that's one thing. Another thing that one of our regulators require is anytime you have a new process, a new piece of equipment, something new or dramatically changed, that everyone is informed, updated, and re-educated. And so that's something to also consider is, you know, if there is a huge change in the practice. So now, you know, it's the individual's responsibility to gain that new information because it's changed from school. It may have even changed from, you know, 5 years ago. We have a whole new thing to do. How to keep up on that. I think that's why we had added in regulation and sometimes in law, these CE requirements is to force people to be kept up to date. So I'm struggling with that because, you know, I certainly don't want to create hoops to jump through solely because it makes us feel good. You know, there has to be value. So thank you.
Thank you, Maria. Renee?
Hi, yeah, there's a lot of challenges there to setting some type of minimum requirements. However, I do feel like a pharmacist would want some training or want to have validation that their level, or like Maria mentioned, competency level is there to function. So how a pharmacy would determine that if for the the pharmacy portion of what they're doing, that they have the skills and ability to move forward. I think it was mentioned. I was trying to find my notes. Who mentioned this? So sorry, I didn't find it in my scribbles. But if there was not minimum requirements, then somebody was mentioning that for in a community setting, they were required to quickly learn travel medicine and then have to practice that. And they were not necessarily feeling comfortable, or they maybe hadn't finished it before they had to do it. I don't, whatever conflict that kind of arose. So that might be a sort of reverse protection for pharmacists who, in different settings, somebody might feel like it's being sprung on them to become, competent in some specialty area, but they don't feel they have it. Some things are, by their nature, much more complicated than others. So, that's why I'd lead towards agreeing with some kind of minimum requirements, even though recognizing that would be very challenging. So, just going to say that.
Thank you, Renee. Jessie?
I feel pretty strongly that there should be a set of minimum requirements or training. What that looks like, I'm not really sure of, just based on what everyone has said. And the concern, of course, that with public comments stating that someone may be certified on paper. And so part of me thinks that this minimum requirement should be some sort of hands-on practice, whether that be experience, like X amount of years in a certain setting means you don't have to do a hands-on training, or there has to be some sort of hands-on training. And I think I've used this as an example before. Technically on paper, I'm practice of point of care certified, but I haven't practiced it at all. So I would never feel comfortable or practice that in real life. On the other hand, I am travel certified, but my comfort level of being travel certified doesn't actually have to do with my training necessarily, which was all virtual. It more so has to do with my experience going through the process of travel medicine and going to a yellow fever clinic, which was a 3-part process. So having that experience and having been an immunization certified pharmacist for so long in a community setting, doing that all the time in my years in retail practice makes me feel more confident in that. And I don't know that I would feel confident necessarily just based on the training that I had. So it's really difficult. I think there's a lot of factors to consider, and I think we should consider experience in a specific area as like a way to potentially bypass the minimum competency or certification training. But I do think that there should be some sort of hands-on training depending on what we're talking about.
Thank you, Jessie. And Nicole, I see your hand raised. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Just wanted to add on. Thanks everyone for your comments. They were super helpful. I do think one thing we want to consider, things that we've learned from back-to-back pandemics, is we would want to have something in place to allow quick mobilization if something came up. So if we did have minimum requirements, is there something that allows pharmacists to very quickly mobilize to give a new type of vaccine, to provide COVID treatments? We had the Mpox vaccines come just a few months ago, very suddenly. So I think we want to make sure we don't have requirements that hinder us in those emergency situations. I love Jesse's idea of if you have a certain amount of experience, you don't have to do certain trainings. I don't know how we, validate that, but I think that that's a really, really good idea. So that was it. Thanks.
Thank you, Nicole. Anyone wants to add any thoughts before we open up for public comment on this question? Okay, Sarah, I think it's your turn.
This is the moderator, and at the direction of the committee, I have opened up the Q&A feature for public comment. Members of the public, if you would like to make a comment on this item, please click the Q&A icon located at the bottom right-hand corner of your WebEx screen or use the raise hand function. And I'll go ahead and pause a moment to allow the public time to access those features and submit their requests. All right, and seeing none, would you like me to close that Q&A panel?
Yes, please. Thank you. I'm surprised. No comments on this one. I would like to hear more on it, but so understand that. So with this, it is 12:16. We probably have to adjourn for today. It's really unfortunate because the discussion's flowing so well, and I really wish we could just keep on, but we have, unfortunately, second part of the day is full board meeting, so we all have to go. And I would really like to make sure all of us get at least a lunch break, at least an hour. So we're gonna have to probably cut short today. Unfortunately, we didn't get through all the questions. So members, we are gonna probably have to schedule another meeting before February because I really would like to have a report of something by February. So we need to get through all the policy questions so that the staff can start developing policy questions. So we'll very soon announce the next meeting before February. Hopefully we can all make it. And I know holidays also coming up, so we will try to make it work. With that, we're gonna thank everyone for all your time, members. Oh, yeah, Maria. So go ahead, Maria.
I just wanted to announce that hopefully Renee and everyone in her community is safe. They had a moderate sized earthquake a half hour ago, and it's on the news now. I haven't heard of any damages, but hopefully it's just inconvenience.
Oh my gosh, Gary. All right, Renee, stay safe. We need you in this committee and we need you in this board, so please stay safe. All right, everyone, so we're gonna adjourn. Before we adjourn, I would really like to thank everyone again for participation, all the stakeholders, especially our board members, committee members. Thank you. This has been a real great discussion. You all really have put so much effort into it. Thank you, all the stakeholders, all the participants in the survey who can't make it to the meetings, all the speakers for your very well thought out thoughts and your comments. Please stay involved, voice your thoughts, share your comments. We will be going on this for another at least 6 months to 9 months. So please stay involved and also stay involved with all the other activities of the board, like including Medication Error Reduction Committee, which is scheduled for November 16th. We will probably try to schedule this meeting at the other half of that day. So just a little probable preview of what's to come, but we will have to confirm that by working with staff. Everyone, thank you so much. To the board members, enjoy your lunch as we will be back in about an hour at the full board meeting. So enjoy your
President Ellis?
Nicole,
Sorry,
yeah.
can I confirm it's at 1:30, not 1 o'clock, right?
Right, 1:30. Yes.
Thank you.
1:30.
Yeah.